The problems in her life began with disagreements with her father. The raging flames destroyed everything in their path. It was also merciless towards her mother. She saved her life but took her father's heart with her. Then, the young lady looked at his poor father with tears in her eyes in horror. Then, to her surprise, she did not see his tears. But then it seemed to her that she clearly heard his thoughts. He forbade everyone in the house to use magic, but only with her help could she contact her mother. After one of these connections, she was taken aback and looked at her father in horror. He shouted as he left that he had told her many times, as well as everyone in the family, that they were all forbidden to use magic. But she screamed that she just wanted to talk to her mother for a while, because that was the only way to contact her. Abby ran after him, reaching for the necklace that connected her to her mother, but it was all in vain. And at that moment she accidentally gave in. He looked at his daughter with anger and sadness, and said that it would be better if he did not have such a disobedient daughter like her. After this, she went to the city of witchcraft, and did not see her father for more than 9 years. She understood that even if she returned to the capital at the invitation of the royal house, the Duke's mansion, which was already falling apart, would not have given her a warm welcome. Abby really thought that they would remain strangers to each other, because there was no way for him to fix everything. But their next meeting was very sad. She was taken aback when her father came to her defense, and was mortally wounded. She was in shock. She didn't understand how everything turned into such chaos. The young lady looked in horror at the people who were engulfed in darkness. At that very moment, she looked at her father, and asked him to hold on. He looked at her, but Abby told him he didn't need to talk because she was going to save him. She was shocked when her magic didn't work on him. The Duke said that she should not waste her energy on him in vain. He looked intently at his daughter, and said with the last of his strength that the children needed her help. At that very moment, he handed his daughter her mother's pendant. Abby burst into tears. She didn't understand why he did something like that, because he hated her. At that very moment, with the last of his strength, he said that she had to stop him. Abby looked closely at Charles Stuart, the new monarch. She knew he was an unworthy man who had deceived everyone, the man who promised to protect her family and raise the empire from its knees. She was furious because she had helped him gain the throne, and now she received such gratitude from him. At that moment, Abby looked at the young man with fury, and asked what he had done. Mocking her, he said that it was all for the sake of his coronation. Carl said that the magical array had already begun to act, and she should listen to a wonderful symphony of pain and despair, as everyone was sacrificed. She screamed furiously that he was just crazy, and at the same time she used her magic. But at that very moment she was taken aback and froze in shock, as she did not understand what was happening at all. She was very scared and shocked, because she saw that the magic array was blocking her spell. At that moment, her legs gave way, and she fell to the ground, but she also realized that this was not simple magic. Carl came closer to her and looked at her with a grin. Bursting with laughter, he said that she was still a great magician, but she couldn't cope with the magical field. He said that it seemed like he had simply overestimated her. At that very moment he looked at her menacingly, and, pointing his mighty hand at her, said that she should go to hell. He closed her eyes, and then the darkness began to consume her. The young lady was in shock as darkness engulfed everything around her. The world was falling apart, and the process was irreversible. Eventually, everything faded, and her memories of the past gradually faded. Now she realized that she had made a mistake, because her father had asked her to stay away from Carl. She realized that she had been blind, and her actions had led to death. She felt a pang of divination, and wondered where it all went wrong. She prayed because she wanted to make everything right. She really wanted to start all over again. Some time later, the young lady opened her eyes in horror. She was taken aback and looked around as if she was in her bedroom. Abby was a little confused, as she didn't understand what was going on at all. But at that very moment, she rushed to the mirror, and looking at her reflection, she wondered if her prayer had really been heard. She looked at her hands in surprise, as she saw bandages there. At that very moment, the servants entered the room, and they saw that the lady had woken up. Abby looked at them in confusion. The manager looked closely at the young lady, and said that this time she had really made them worry. She smiled and said that she really didn't remember anything. The manager was puzzled. He sighed heavily and said that she had had an argument with her father and accidentally fallen down the stairs and was unconscious for several days. She sighed heavily as she realized what he was talking about. The manager told her that she didn't need to worry, as she only had a small cut, but at that very moment, she healed herself with magic. The manager was shocked and shouted at the young lady to stop. Moments later, they were taken aback as the Duke entered the room. Abby froze for a moment as she saw her father. She stared at him for a moment, unable to believe that it was not a dream. At that moment, he looked at her menacingly. As she used magic again, he said that she disappointed him. At that very moment, her head suddenly became heavy, and she was unable to make out anything that her father was telling her. She remembered that she had returned to the time when she had gone to the city of witchcraft, because then they had quarreled. She knew that nothing had happened yet and there was no tragedy. The butler looked intently at the young lady and said that he had addressed the Duke to her. Winston burst into tears at that very moment. She looked at her father with tears in her eyes and said with a smile that she missed him very much. Abby was in shock, because she could never imagine that she would see her father like this again. Rather than being covered in blood from head to toe, she was, in turn, very glad that she could see him. At that very moment, the young lady, overjoyed, rushed to her father and hugged him tightly. Everyone present was shocked by her behavior. The manager looked at the young lady in surprise and asked why she was crying, but she could not explain anything and only called for her father. With tears in her eyes, she said that she missed her father very much because her past life was very difficult. The manager was puzzled and did not understand what was being discussed, but at that moment she was taken aback as the Duke pushed her away, looked at him with tears in her eyes, because she did not understand why everything was like this. As he left, the Duke told the steward to call the doctor and told his daughter to rest. She sighed heavily, as she wanted her father to be near her. She was lost in her thoughts for a moment, as she remembered that during that period of time, she and her father were constantly arguing. After all, she secretly took her mother's ruby necklace and, contrary to her father's wishes, studied magic. She sighed heavily, as she realized that he would not forgive a daughter like her. As he left, he sighed heavily and said that it was very good that she had finally come to her senses. Abby looked after her father with a happy smile, because she knew that he still loved her. Therefore, her initial task was to establish a good relationship with her father. The next day the Duke woke up slowly, and at that very moment he was taken aback, because he saw his daughter, who was joyfully telling him that he needed to wash his face and brush his teeth. He looked at her in bewilderment, as he did not understand what was going on at all. After some time, she sat him down at the table with a smile, where there was a beautifully prepared meal that she had prepared herself. She circled around him happily and said that she would give him a massage. After some time, they slowly returned to the office, and she happily said that she would help him with his work. But to her regret, she saw that her father's favor towards her had not increased. At that moment, she sighed heavily, as it seemed to her that her denial, rather than her favor, had sooner passed over his head. At the same time, the maids looked sideways at the mistress and said that she most likely hit her head. And at that very moment, she said that she heard everything, but at that very moment, the servant disappeared from her field of vision. The young lady was puzzled as her plan had failed, but Abby really wanted to have a good relationship with her father. She was puzzled because she realized that she had a lot of work ahead of her. After all, she started all over again. But now she gradually began to understand her father, because he did not allow her to use magic, because he was afraid that she would be in danger. The most ancient family, which stood at the origins of the Sullan Empire, her surname was Kamla. The street opened up to splendor, glory, and greatness. As the bards sang, the hand of Khalid sowed rice, the hand of Lion wielded a spear, and gold and diamonds scattered from Kamal's hands. But the shining gem did more than just bring shine. After all, this is what brought bloodshed and misfortune to their family. Mother, older brother, second brother, all the people he loved, disappeared one after another. Abby assumed that was the reason her father didn't allow her to go to the Tower of the Magic Tree to protect her. He allowed her to be left out of the fight for the throne, but in her past life she had no idea what he was thinking, and she left home herself. Some time later, the Duke looked at the invitation from the Tower of the Magic Tree, but wondered if it was too early for her to go to the tower. He really wanted her to stay out of the fight for the throne, but he also didn't want her to continue practicing magic, because it was dangerous. A moment later the young lady informed her father that she had come to see him and said that he was not resting at all. The Duke was puzzled, as his daughter had been very clingy to him lately, but at the same moment she said that she needed to talk to him. He allowed her to enter the office, and at the same moment he said that he really hoped that this was really important. Otherwise, she wouldn't need to stand in the office. She asked for forgiveness, and he said that if that was all, then she could go. Abby was furious because she saw the distance coming from him. Abby said she came to ask him about the letter from the Tower of the Magic Tree. He said that they had already figured it out, because he had not intended to let her learn magic. She was puzzled because she knew he was still worried, but she told him he didn't need to worry. Abby said she came to him to tell him that she had already dealt with this matter, and that she was not going to the tower. Abby said she used to be stupid, and didn't realize what she was doing because of her temper. She said she never thought about him. Looking at her father, she said with complete seriousness that she wanted to fulfill her duties as a member of the family. He froze in shock. The Duke said he didn't know what she was thinking, but also said that fulfilling family responsibilities was not easy. She said that she understood everything, as she knew that he was the only one responsible for their family, and in the end he protected her at the cost of his own life. She intended to change everything and be with her father. The Duke was taken aback, as he did not expect anything like this from his daughter. But at that very moment, she smiled and said that she could not always be the child who was under the protection of her father. At that very moment, the butler entered the Duke's office and was taken aback when he saw the expression on the young lady's face. He looked after her in surprise, as it seemed to him that she had grown up in just one night. The Duke said it looked more like a temporary clouding of her vision than like maturation. He said that it seemed like he had been putting too much pressure on her, because she suddenly started talking about family responsibilities. The Duke looked at the manager with alarm, and asked if she was going to knock him out and sneak away with the letter. The butler smiled and said that was her style. He said excitedly that the lady also used high-vol healing magic. He noticed that her talent was the same as that of the late Duchess, and it was not even surprising that the magic tower invited her, but he knew that having such talent was not always good. After all, she could become a target for the nobility and the royal family, and she could also become a tool in the struggle for the throne. The Duke sighed heavily, and, looking at his late wife's necklace, said that he was very worried about his daughter. She wanted to say goodbye to the uncomfortable magic tower and choose the path of her family. She understood that there would be many dangers along this path, but she knew that one careless move and the world could collapse much faster than in the past. Abby knew that this was the only way she could get closer to the truth. She was determined to be on her father's side in this life. She was glad that she had been transported to this particular day, because after a fight with her father in her past life, she had gone to the magic tower alone. It was a wonderful place, isolated from the world, and she did not regret the time she spent in the tower at all, because there she met her mentor, Professor Maney, and she also gradually realized how innocent and ridiculous her desire for her mother's return was. At that time, she was not allowed to return home, and she could only feverishly study magic and fill her head with knowledge. Abby thought that this would stop her from missing home, but as time went on, the longing still began to fill her. She wandered around the tower for a long time, questioning whether she should return home. Sometime later, she was sitting at her desk and writing down all the events that happened in her past life. She knew she had been reborn, but she had no idea what she should do, since nothing had happened yet. And there was much she didn't understand, because in truth, their family was currently showing no signs of decline, as pure-blooded nobles of the empire. She didn't understand why her family suddenly collapsed after many years. Unfortunately, she had no useful information at all in her past life. She realized that it would be very good if her professor were here. Abby was glad that she still had her memories, but her current level of magical power left much to be desired, and she knew she would have to use her mother's necklace. She sighed heavily, as she realized that she needed to start with what she knew, because it had returned, accepting Karl's invitation. This was the most intense period of the struggle for the throne. The battle between Karl and the third prince's faction came to the fore. If we compare the third prince and Charles, Charles had no advantage over the third prince, who was favored by the former emperor. For this reason, he came to the magic tower for help. At that time, her father had angered the former emperor, and would have lost his lands and status as a duke. She knew that she also needed his help to protect the family. But to her regret, she was late, because upon arriving in the capital, she learned that both of her older brothers were dead. The elder brother died several years ago, and the second brother, a few days after she arrived, was killed by someone. Karl told her that her healthy brother was killed by the people of the third prince. She, because she had not seen her family for a long time, and having received such a blow, did not think twice and at that very moment believed him. She knew she had acted rashly, and there was obviously another option. She thought that most likely Carlos had planned everything and blamed the prince. She understood that, most likely, he took advantage of her, controlling her revenge for her family, but now she understood that he had built everything. Abby was furious. She remembered how he had told her at the end that they should go to hell together. At that moment she was taken aback, as she assumed that Karl was dead. She was worried that he could be reborn just like her. A moment later, a maid entered her room and said with a smile that she had brought her tea. But at that very moment she was taken aback and looked at her mistress in surprise. Abby turned around and said with a smile that she was going to kill Prince Charles. She could not sleep peacefully without seeing it for herself. She hoped he hadn't gone crazy yet, and if he had, she had to get rid of him. She knew she had to deal with him right now. At that very moment, the maid looked at her mistress in surprise and asked if something had happened. Abby smiled and said that nothing of the sort had happened. She realized that she had clothes that helped hide her face, but she couldn't find them. She was shocked because her plan had failed before it even began. The maid asked if the mistress was really looking for suitable clothes for the celebration in honor of my brother's return. The young lady froze for a moment, as she realized that she would soon be able to see her brother. At that very moment, the maid, smiling, told her mistress what she could wear. Abby thought for a moment, as her brother was the same in her memories, as he was a workaholic from birth. She knew that all the money he earned was spent on her clothes. In her past life, she was unable to thank him. She knew that her brother was really dead, because she saw his body with her own eyes. She was taken aback when she heard the news from Carl, and simply couldn't believe what she heard. But the prince looked at her intently, and said that her brother was indeed dead. The maid looked at her mistress in surprise, and asked if she was okay. Abby was lost in her thoughts, but she knew that she would not allow this to happen again. At the same time, in the palace, the knights looked around warily, as they heard a suspicious sound. The young man told his comrades that it was most likely a ghost, but he quickly dealt with it and told him to calm down. The young man knew that they had to check everything thoroughly just in case. They came closer to the bushes, but there was no one there. At that very moment, the young lady was sitting quietly in the bushes. She used invisibility magic, but she knew that just a little more, and she would have been exposed. Lova was confused because her magical power level was too low, so she continued to use her mother's necklace. At the same time, she stole this necklace from her father's box. A moment later she looked back and looked into the distance, as she realized that she was already there. She looked intently into the distance, because she knew where Carl was now. Moment later, she used her magic and rose into the air with ease. She knew that Carl was the man who brought the world to ruin. She knew he was evil, cunning, a pompous liar with a black heart. But if there was anything unusual about him, she needed to see for herself. A moment later, she saw Carl sitting and quietly reading a book. We froze in shock, as she didn't expect anything like this. At that very moment, the maid approached the prince and called him. He sighed heavily and said that he knew she was already leaving. Abby was a little confused, because she didn't know where he was going. She thought for a moment, as he looked quite normal. But at that very moment she was taken aback, because she heard a man's voice. She looked at the young man in surprise, as he was truly handsome. She knew she had used invisibility magic, so he was not speaking to her, but at that very moment the young man said he was talking to her. She was taken aback and froze in place from shock. He looked at her intently, as he thought that she was an uninvited guest who had snuck into the palace. Invisibility is a highly level magic that allows one to become invisible to other people. Only ordinary people, but even most of the magicians could not notice her when she used this magic. She was taken aback because the young man managed to see her. She was surprised when she saw his eyes. Abby was a little confused, because she knew there was a problem, and she needed to knock him out. The young man told the girl that she should not do anything stupid, since magic does not work on him. He wanted to know who she really was, and what she was doing in a place like this. He realized that since she was silent, it meant she was afraid that she could be recognized by her voice. At that very moment, he began to list all the famous names, and she was taken aback, as he had come very close to her. He said he was very keen to know if she was there, because she had had dealings with his younger brother, but he was more keen to bring her to justice and find out the whole truth. She was puzzled, because she saw that the magical energy was not gathering, and she was unable to cast the spell. For a moment she was taken aback, as she realized that he had not lied about the magic not working on him. She realized that she needed to escape urgently, and she could only use tricks to escape, but such tricks had no effect on him, and at that very moment he rushed towards the young refugee. She was taken aback, as she did not expect him to rush after her. At that very moment, the young man grabbed her hand with his ease. She was in shock, and did not understand how he could do such a thing. He looked at her with a fierce and satisfied grin, and said that he had caught her. But a moment later the young man was taken aback, as he felt some kind of energy. Abby was confused. She didn't understand what kind of strange feelings she felt. But at that very moment the young lady realized that this was her chance to escape. A moment later, she used her magic and easily ran away from him. The young man looked at her intently, and with surprise, as everything happened unexpectedly. He knew that using magic and flying at such a height was beyond the capabilities of ordinary magicians. For a moment he stared at his hand, which had previously embraced the young lady, and a moment later knights burst into the room. The prince looked at them intently, and told them to go down immediately, and examine everything carefully. At that very moment, the young prince entered the room, as he saw all the commotion. Wayne looked at his brother with a smile, and said that a cat had run into them. Carl smiled, and said that he had already finished reading the book that his brother had given him. The young man looked at his brother with a smile, and told him to get some rest. Carl smiled and agreed with his brother, but at that very moment he looked after him with a sly grin. For a moment he watched his brother intently as he walked away slowly. At the same time, the young lady was breathing heavily. standing in a dark alley. She was puzzled because she knew that everything was very risky. She was confused because she did not remember a single person from her past life who could do something like this. She was in shock and simply couldn't get her head around this situation. She knew that the only person important to Carl in his past life was a secret agent whom she had never seen. But Abby had heard that the agent was a soft and weak man. She assumed that the young man she had seen earlier was not the prince's agent, since he looked majestic and seemed to be an aristocrat. She also noticed that he had a ferocity that was usually found in those who had served in the army. She understood that he could not be the older brother prince at all. But at that very moment she was taken aback, as she realized that her assumptions were correct. She wondered if this was true, since she had heard earlier that Carl's older brother had died. Abby had heard before that Carl was very similar to his brother. Carl coldly answered her that his brother had died, and he did not want to stir up his memories. She was taken aback because she realized that now was the time when his brother was still alive. She understood that if this was true, then dealing with him would be more difficult than with Carl. But the young lady was a little puzzled, because when he grabbed her, she felt as if she had been shocked by electricity. She realized that Carl had not gone completely crazy, so she wanted to use magic and return home as soon as possible. She understood that if she had her old body, she would be able to use the highest form of magic with ease. At that very moment, the young lady was taken aback, as she realized that she had lost her mother's precious necklace. Some time later, the knight reported to the prince that they had not found anyone suspicious. He sighed heavily and told the knight to return to his work immediately. He was a little puzzled and didn't know who that unusual magician was. But moments later he was taken aback as he noticed something shining in the bushes. Coming closer, he looked in surprise at the beautiful necklace. After a moment, he reached out to it and froze in place for a moment in surprise. After some time, the young lady found herself in a beautiful living room. She was a little puzzled and wondered if this was all a dream. At that very moment she saw the prince, who was quietly reading a book. The prince looked at the young lady with a smile and called her. He asked with a smirk why she was so surprised to be in such a place. He came closer to her and asked with a smile if she was afraid of him. He smiled slyly and asked if she wanted to tear everyone to pieces with him. A moment later, the young lady was taken aback as she woke up from a terrible nightmare. She sighed heavily and, looking out the window, realized that it had not even blossomed yet, and then she realized that the meeting with the prince had shaken her. Abby knew he looked harmless then, but she knew it was just her imagination. After all, Abby knew that he was actually very good at disguising himself. After all, when they first met, even though he was a prince, he still treated her sincerely and showed respect. At that time, the young ladies looked at the legendary crown prince with admiration. Be it her or the other students of the Magic Treat Hour, he was friendly and courteous to everyone. He thanked her with a smile for giving him her time. Abby looked timidly at the prince and asked if her father had really been punished. The prince looked at her intently and said that it was so, and he had already passed judgment on the duke. Then he told her that he wanted to win the fight for the throne, not in order to gain money or power. He said he wanted to do this to fulfill one person's wish. The prince said that he really hoped that he could change the country, which was rotten to the core, and so he wanted to have talented people on his side. Abby was touched by his words then, but it turned out that these words were just a beautiful tool, but he used to play with human hearts. Then he seemed sincere, polite and unperturbed to her, but deep down he mocked the imperial power, the throne, and his father. She understood that such a convincing disguise must have had an original source. She wondered who he was imitating so ardently. At that moment, Abby was taken aback, as she realized that he was imitating the young man she had seen earlier. She assumed he had encountered murder before, as he had almost been killed by a hitman at a banquet. There was a commotion at one of the banquets, and at that very moment the knights rushed to defend the prince. But the hired killer easily dispersed all of the prince's guards, and a moment later brought to the prince himself. But a moment later, the young lady used her magic and disarmed the mercenary. She was able to easily bind him with her magic. At the same time, the prince thanked her with a smile for her invaluable help. At the same time, officials were furious. They demanded that the prince punish the culprit. Carl thought it over calmly and made his verdict. He looked intently at everyone present and said that they must understand who hired him and for what purpose. At that time, he did not execute the murderer on the spot, but calmly wiped the blood from his face. Later he began to calm the nobles and officials present. Then she and everyone else saw that he looked like a man who was worthy of the throne. But later the young lady heard something interesting when she passed by the prince's room. Then he raged, because his beautiful face was wounded, and later he spoke before the nobles, pretending that he did not care. He, burning with rage, shouted that the murderer and all those standing behind him should be thrown into the forest to be fed to the monster. Abby froze in her tracks when she heard that, as he wanted them dead. Then she realized that on the outside he was one thing, but on the inside he was completely different, and from then on she gradually began to distance herself from him. He soon became emperor and returned the title to her family, but her father still did not want to see her. Unfortunately, Abby had to leave the capital and return to the tower, which also led to her relationship with Karl being severed. At that time, she thought that a person who was an emperor did not necessarily have to be a good person. About a year later, she received an anonymous letter asking her for help because the emperor was into black magic. She thought for a moment that when she returned, she would see that the emperor had already completed the magical sacrificial circle with dark magic. She brought up that people can't just look at appearances, so now she was only thinking about the magic circle. Abby knew there was a worse problem, as she was running away and had no control over her power, and in doing so, her magic had broken the chain on her necklace. She was puzzled, because she understood that her jewel was most likely now in the possession of the young man, and this was very bad. After all, Abby knew that if her father found out about what had happened, she would be in trouble. However, she threw all her thoughts away, as she realized that she needed to get at least some sleep. At that very moment, she became immersed in her thoughts, and assumed that there was some secret between the young people. Sometime later, the young lady used magic to cast a spell on a small necklace. She understood that if the appearance of ordinary illusion magic was dispelled, then it would be the end of her. She never would have thought that the strange thing would be useful to her, but she knew that her head was a mess right now. But she also understood that she needed to return this necklace to her father's office as soon as possible. She also needed to go to the palace as soon as possible and return the real necklace, as she didn't have much time. At the same time, she didn't even know who the guy was who took the necklace. Abby was lost in her thoughts, oblivious to everyone around her. But still, Abby was a little puzzled, as she didn't understand the expression on her father's face. After all, she simply asked if he knew Prince Wayne, and he had remained silent since then. After a moment, her father finally spoke, and she was convinced that he was the crown prince. The Duke wanted to know why she was asking about him. She asked as if she wanted to return the stolen necklace and sort out everything that was connected with Karl. But, unfortunately, she couldn't say something like that to her father, and now she has to lie to him. The Duke sighed heavily and asked if it was really so difficult for her to answer the question. At the same time, he said that this does not fit the definition of working on family matters. She realized that it didn't matter at all what she answered to the question. Abby smiled and told her father that she wanted to know how he ran the family business. Then she said with a smile that she needed this information for marriage. Abby knew it was just a small lie and hoped it would be enough. Abby knew that there were already blood ties between the royal family and the aristocrats now, and that this was not a means to stabilize the relationship between the nobles and the royal family. The Duke said that she could marry a member of the Lion or call it a family, but the royal family would be against such a union. She was glad because she saw that he was in a good mood. At the same time, the Duke said that there are currently 3 children in the royal family, namely the elder Prince Wayne, the second Prince Karl, and Unseltiu Sen. The young lady knew that the third prince was a baby who was not fit for marriage. The Duke said he had heard that Prince Charles was a reclusive person by nature and did not wish to participate in public activities. The young lady listened quietly to her father, for she knew what the prince really was like. She smiled and said she thought Prince Wayne might be the perfect candidate. The Duke looked menacingly at his daughter and asked how much she knew about him that she could judge something like that. She smiled and said that she had heard that he was very handsome. At that very moment, she cleared her throat and said that he was a real leader. He also had a cold temperament. She knew he blended into the night, as she didn't even notice how he managed to approach her. Abby said that he was skilled in fighting, and his gaze was sharp like a blade, and he was also very fast as he grabbed her with ease. But nevertheless, she believed that he was kind, and he was kind to his brothers, which meant he would be kind to others. And besides, she noticed his beautiful smile. So the young lady happily said that he was very handsome, and she meant it from the bottom of her heart. That very moment, she froze in place, as she saw that her father had darkened. The Duke quickly stood up and told his daughter that they would talk about it later, and as a result they left the subject alone. For some time the maid happily did her mistress's hair, and praised her beautiful hair. But Abby knew that, unfortunately, after a few years, her hair would not be so beautiful, because she would be madly using magic. Some time later, the maid, still smiling happily, asked her mistress if she would like to try on the new dress that her brother had sent her. The maid said with a smile, "Madame, her brother is currently in another country, but he misses you very much." A moment later, the young lady tried on an exquisite outfit. The maid happily said, Madame, that this outfit suited her very well. Wabi was very happy to see the beautiful outfit and her brother's care. At that very moment, the maid anxiously asked her mistress if she was really marrying the crown prince. She was alarmed and wanted to know whether her mistress was really seriously considering such a marriage, because she had heard many bad rumors about the crown prince. She told the lady that she heard that he was very cruel, despotic, ruthless, and bloodthirsty. She said his sword was a magical blade that fed on human blood, and yet it shone scarlet in the moonlight. And when he walked, he created pores of dark wine, and anyone who passed by was immediately poisoned and found themselves at death's door. The young lady was shocked by these rumors, but the maid kept telling her mistress to stay away from him. She said that these outrageous rumors were not unfounded, since even the emperor himself disliked him. At that moment she thought for a moment, because she realized that when she said such words to her father, he immediately realized that she was lying to him. At the same time, the duke quietly approached his daughter's room and knocked timidly. Moment later, the young lady greeted him with a joyful smile. She was alarmed and did not understand why he came so quickly. Moment later, the duke handed her a small letter, namely an invitation to a ball at the palace. The duke said she had previously said she wanted to take on family responsibilities. The duke also informed his daughter that her elder brother would receive an award at the banquet, and that the crown prince would also be there. The butler was alarmed and asked the gentleman if everything would be all right, since the lady had never attended such events before. And besides, he saw that the duke was angry with her because she wanted to meet the crown prince. The duke was seething with rage as his daughter asked him about the opposite sex for the first time. He wanted to make her understand what a scum the prince was. The butler was taken aback, as he realized that this was a personal animosity. The duke knew it was time to contact the prince about the magic mine. When the young lady's mother died, she hid in the closet in tears, but after some time, she heard a familiar voice. Her brother slowly opened the closet door and asked if he could come in and sit next to her. He looked at her with a tender smile and said that she had found a very good place for Togo to be alone for a while. He smiled and said that if she was sad, there was nothing wrong with her sitting in a place like that. He said with a smile that he had come up with something to fill her closet with, and that way, whenever she wants to hide in the closet, she can always find a couple of warm blankets. Sometime later, the butler showed the young lady what she needed to learn. Gabby was in shock because she had to learn a lot in a short period of time. She knew she could use magic, and it would speed up the whole process, but she saw total control. Abby was puzzled because she had a lot to learn before the banquet. The butler reported that the Duke had previously said that if she did not know even the basics, she would not be able to attend the banquet. The butler told the young lady with a smile that she had less than a month left to learn all the information. She was puzzled because she realized that everything was more serious than she had assumed. However, she knew that she had to attend the ball. After some time, she began to take etiquette lessons. The young lady repeated everything after her teacher in a strange way. The teacher praised the young lady with a smile. She also had painting lessons. Her teacher was truly shocked by her wonderful talent. He spoke with admiration that for a newbie, her skills were impressive. Later, she started having history lessons. She told the teacher everything she remembered with a gentle smile. He was glad because she had learned all the material perfectly. The servants looked at their mistress with a joyful smile, as they saw that she was very talented. Abby was pleased because this was another life of hers, and she could easily tell the past and the future. She was pleased because now everything was going better than she thought. But, unfortunately, dance lessons didn't work for her. She studied strangely, but every time she was reprimanded. Abby was puzzled because she was in for a complete failure in the end. The young man looked at his sister with a smile and asked why she stopped. She froze when she saw her brother in front of her. She simply couldn't believe her eyes. At that very moment, she pounced on her brother with tears in her eyes. Patrick looked at his sister with a tender smile and invited her to dance. At that very moment, he bowed and with a contented smile extended his hand to her. She was taken aback, as she realized that she was not a very good dancer. Patrick smiled and told her that she didn't need to worry because she just had to follow him. Abby looked at her brother intently, as she thought it was just a dream, but at that very moment she felt the warmth of her beloved brother's hand. Abby enjoyed every moment of their dance with tenderness. She was lost in her thoughts, noticing anything. He smiled and said that she seemed to be in a bad mood lately, as he couldn't feel his legs. Abby was taken aback and asked for forgiveness with tears in her eyes, since she didn't know how to dance at all. Patrick smiled and said that the atmosphere was very good, and if they continued to train together, she would shine at the ball. Abby realized that for the good of her family and brother, she had to practice dancing so as not to bring shame on her family. Light intently at her brother and shouted that today, until she learned to dance, she would not leave the room. He looked at his sister with a smile and said that she needed to take a little rest and loosen her grip. He also told his sister that he would like to visit one place with her. Both were taken aback, since their father had previously forbidden her to leave the house. Patrick said that he had already made arrangements with his father, as he wanted to take her to the most beautiful place where she could buy a lot of exquisite jewelry, like clear dew early in the morning, like a misty haze on a rainy day, like the most beautiful sunset on a summer evening. Fingers frame the ears and neck fall. This is the wonderful dime and star boutique. She was surprised and at the same time very happy, because she was able to visit a wonderful place. An etiquette teacher once told her that jewelry and dresses were the weapons and armor of a socialite, because they directly determine success or failure in high society. No matter how small the banquet, a lady had to shine. Abby knew the situation was more complicated than she expected, so her brother brought her to a place like this. She was glad of the opportunity and knew she needed to arm herself immediately. Patrick looked at his sister with a smile and asked what she was thinking about. She didn't have time to answer, and he asked with a smile if she really thought he wanted to buy her jewelry that would win over other women. She was taken aback and asked in surprise how he knew about her thoughts. Patrick looked at his sister with a smile and said that he was her brother and knew about everything. Looking away from his sister, he said that since he took her to a clothing store, it could indeed mislead her. Sometime later, he was smiling and buying her beautiful clothes. Abby looked worriedly at her brother's wedding and said that he really needed to be more frugal, since she already had too many clothes at home. He smiled and said that he would try, but for some reason she didn't trust him. Sometime later, they entered a beautiful jewelry store. Abby knew that even if there were people who were not interested in precious stones at all, they would be enchanted by the sparkle of beautiful stones now. Patrick looked at his sister with a smile and said that the owner of this shop was the Count, who was a further acquaintance of their family, and all the stones were provided by their family, so she could choose whatever she liked. She thought for a moment, as it all fit with what she knew. The gem mining business was their family's main industry, and now she assumed that the reason for their family's decline was the depletion of the mines. Patrick noticed that his sister was worried about something. He looked at her closely and said with a smile that even now she was worried about a lot of things. He asked her not to strain herself too much, because she had to learn to relax a little. Abby looked at her brother with a tender smile, as she noticed that he could definitely read her mind, but he smiled and said that she was exaggerating. At that very moment, a knight burst into the store and called Patrick. He quietly told him something, and Abby noticed that her brother was excited about something. Patrick looked at his sister intently, and, after asking for forgiveness, said that he had urgent business to attend to. He asked if she could wait for him in the store, while he sorted out all the problems. At that very moment, the young lady agreed with her brother, and watched him leave. The young lady looked at Abby with a smile, and asked her to look at the beautiful jewelry. She showed her rings and bracelets that were made with special care and elegance. The young lady was taken aback for a moment. She realized that she only wanted the necklace, but she could not take her eyes off the beautiful jewelry. Moment later, she froze and looked at the jewelry, which was made of rubies. She was told that the master jeweler spent several years to make this necklace. The lady looked at Abby with a smile, and said that it would suit her very well. Abby thought for a moment, and looked closely at the necklace, as she felt an invisible attraction. At that very moment, she asked the girl to show her the necklace closer, but a moment later they heard the voice of another customer, who shouted that she also wanted yes, but she wanted the necklace. Moment later, a young lady entered the store with Grace. She looked at Abby with intense disdain, but later informed her that such a dazzling necklace was worthy only of her. The young girls froze for a moment, as they were surprised by her words, but at that very moment, Abby was taken aback, as she was shocked. She didn't expect to see Carl's wife in front of her at all. The knight looked at Patrick intently, and apologized for calling him out personally. The young man sighed heavily, and said that everything was fine, and that they should immediately tell him what had happened. The knight said that the man tried to attack the civilians, and he had a strange weapon with him, and so they were worried that it could be a magical artifact. Moment later, Patrick examined the weapon closely, but he did not see any magical flow. He looked closely at the knight, and said that they had done the right thing in treating the criminal with caution, but they did not need to worry anymore, since it was a simple dagger. Patrick also said that they should immediately take the offender to the security officer. At that very moment, Patrick turned around because he saw a familiar silhouette. The young man smiled and asked Patrick if they could talk a little. Patrick was taken aback for a moment and froze in surprise. Peggy Lyons is a villain who became Carl's wife. Her father was Carl's right-hand man. She lived in a world where power and desire were intertwined, yet she attached great importance to her status as queen. She tried to make sure that they did not communicate in their past life, but every time they met, the young lady looked at her with arrogance. Abby supposed that in the eyes of the young lady, Even though she was Carl's assistant, she still posed a threat to her. Peggy looked at the girl intently and told her to pack the necklace she had been given and send it to the lion's estate. She looked at the girl with fury and asked why she was still standing there. She wanted to know if the girl was not at all worried by the words of the daughter of a high-ranking family. At that moment, the young lady came closer to Abby and said angrily that she had never seen her before. She angrily asked if the girl also wanted to get the tribute, but the necklace. Abby looked at the young lady intently, but said nothing. Peggy looked at Abby with disdain and said that she seemed to be aiming for jewelry that would adorn her body and raise her social status. But she said that if Abby did not have capital, then precious stones would be heavy for her. Peggy said mockingly that she might as well try, since that was the only way they would find out how big her capital was after all. Abby sighed heavily as she realized that things were much worse than she had imagined. Peggy mockingly asked the girl why she was silent. She wanted to know if the girl was so angry that she suffered from humiliation. Peggy told the young lady that she could only remain silent and tolerate the stylist Steve, like the main character, who would definitely take revenge in the future. She wanted the young lady to fight with her and make her an eternal enemy, because she understood what a gripping and tense scene that would be. Peggy looked at the young lady with a smirk and said that she really wasn't that easy to defeat. Abby looked closely at the girl, because although clumsy, she hit the target with such words. She assumed that she, like Carl, benefited from this method of suppressing other people, and in this way he, like her, achieved success. At that very moment, a young lady intervened in their conversation and told the girl that she had gone too far, since in front of her now was the daughter of a noble family. Peggy was taken aback as she realized that the young lady was as famous as she was. At moment, Abby grabbed the young lady's hand and glared at her, but a moment later, she said that she was not so easily intimidated. Peggy was taken aback, as she did not expect this, and at that very moment she began to stutter. Abby looked at the girl in bewilderment at how she had changed, and suddenly became somehow strange. Abby looked at the young lady with disdain and said that she would not take the necklace today, but in return, she must leave her eyes immediately. As she left, the young lady said that she would immediately take the necklaces and leave. Abby looked at the young lady with a satisfied smile, as it seemed to her that he had been offending her all the time, and she was afraid of her acting skills. Abby vaguely remembered Carl in his past life talking about the young lady as a beautiful but tasteless vase, but if you think about it, such a vase would be very suitable for a person like Carl, who was like corrupted water. However, she was interested in who the young lady was who had intervened in their conversation. Sometime later, the young lady stood at the entrance of the store and waited for her brother. Patrick ran up to his sister and apologized with a smile for being late, but he was confused because he didn't understand why she was waiting for him outside. Abby smiled and said that she just wanted some fresh air. He asked if she had found a necklace for herself. She sighed heavily and said that, unfortunately, she hadn't found one that suited her. He looked at her in surprise, as he hoped that she would find something for herself, but moments later he learned that she was unable to find a suitable necklace because of one person. He looked at her closely and asked what had happened, but the young lady said that it was an unpleasant but small incident, because she and another lady liked the same necklace, but half of the money from the sale of the necklace would still go to their family, so she was not at a big loss. Patrick thought for a moment, as he knew that this was not the first time that the Lyons family had put a spoke in their wheels. He knew that not only did they act arrogantly in front of the emperor, but even the women of this family humiliated others. He knew that this was a demonstration of their power, and he was therefore very afraid that they might make his sister look bad at the banquet. At that very moment, he remembered the young man he had met earlier on his way, as he had given him a small gift from that man. Patrick sighed heavily and looked closely at his sister. Moment later he presented his sister with a beautiful necklace. She looked at her brother with joy and asked with delight if she would soon have a daughter-in-law. She asked her brother if he had really prepared a wedding necklace for his bride. He looked at her with a smile and asked what she was thinking about. He said that it was her gift from a very important person. The young lady was taken aback by this. He knew that on the day of the ball, his sister would definitely be the center of attention. Sometime later, the young leagues, under cover of night, quietly made their way into the imperial palace. She looked around quietly, as she realized that there was no one nearby, but after a few moments she screamed. But at that very moment she breathed a sigh of relief, as she saw that in front of her was just armor, but still she was overcome with shivers from such an interior. Time passed, and the preparations for the ball were almost complete, but not yet finished. She understood that she should not sit still, because if she found the lost necklace earlier, she would undoubtedly gain an advantage. So when her mana level was restored, she came to the palace again. But in order to regain the skill of complete invisibility, she secretly practiced for a long time, although she understood that the training was not not going very well, and all because she had a small amount of mana, and as a result, her hand remained invisible, or only her legs became invisible. On the way, she accidentally ran into a maid, and as a result, rumors began to spread about a ghost in the estate. But now, Abby realized that this was not the most important thing, because it seemed to her that she had fallen right into a trap. Abby initially thought that whoever found the necklace would be looking for her all over the capital, but nothing like that had happened in the past month. From rumors, she knew that the young man was not in the palace at the moment. She heard that he was ordered to leave to destroy the monsters, but she was puzzled and did not understand what he was thinking about. However, she was determined to find the necklace urgently, so she searched the entire room with lightning speed. But after a moment she stopped and looked at the table in bewilderment. Abby was a little puzzled because she found a small letter. At the same time, the young prince and his retinue were dealing with terrible monsters. He dealt with everyone in his path with ease. But moments later he was distracted as he was informed that Amber was slacking off again. Haynes sighed heavily and stared into the distance. A moment later, he slowly walked up to his comrade and asked if he hadn't gotten up yet. Amber smiled and said that his body was very heavy and he could not move. But at that very moment, he received from his friend, as she shouted, that the wizard must protect the prince. Amber was puzzled. He shouted that his body was very weak, but his girlfriend recommended him to train his own body. Amber shouted that he would not do that, as his prince had more than just a strong body, and so he only intended to train his brain. But at that very moment their argument vanished as a monster advanced on them. At that very moment, the young knight shouted to his comrades to stop chatting and continue fighting the monsters. The young lady easily dealt with the monster on her way, but she was still a little puzzled, since they had just returned and the emperor had given them a task again. She was puzzled and wondered if the palace guards were really good for nothing. The young man looked at his friend and praised her for her excellent work. Amber smiled and said that in the end they were just venting their anger, but at the same time they should know that Meru sent the prince on such missions so that he would simply die in battle. The prince looked intently at his comrade and asked him to calm down and think about what he was talking about. At that very moment, monsters again attacked the prince, but he dealt with them with ease. The young men looked at us with admiration at his prince, as he dealt with his opponents with ease. He looked at them with a smile and said that everything must be done precisely, and not scattered on trifles, and if they intend to kill their enemy, then they must kill him with one blow. After some time, they finally finished the cleanup and intended to return back to the castle. The prince looked at his comrade and said that he had heard that while he was gone, Pierce had sent men to blow up the Kamla family's mine. Amber smiled and said that it was true. The Lyons family's desire to dominate high society was so strong, but they miscalculated a little when they blew up the mine, because then something interesting happened. An inconspicuous stone ore was in a mine with magical stones. However, it was a raw material for making magical items that could be used by ordinary people. This type of ore was originally brought from neighboring countries, and its quantity was small, but no one expected that such ore would be found in the Kamla family's mine. But to mine it legally, permission from the royal family is required. The prince did not think at all that the duke would now tell other families, or his father about this. Amber smiled and said that this was indeed true, and few people knew about it. Even he found out about it purely by accident. An knew full well that the duke had no choice but to contact him. Amber looked at his master with a smirk and told him not to worry, as he would do everything as his master said. Prince Moment thought about everything that was happening. He was puzzled, because he understood that he would still need to sort out the score before that. The emperor was a man who cared about his reputation, mired in debauchery, and this extravagant ball would be full of representatives of the nobility. The prince did not think that his father would set him up there. The prince understood that his father simply wanted to use his power to force him to obey him and carry out all his orders unconditionally. The prince understood that he would not like this. He thought for a moment about the young lady and the ruby necklace, and looking at his comrade, asked if he had done anything unnecessary here. Amber said with a sly smile that he had done nothing extra. The young lady was a little puzzled when she saw the small letter. It was addressed mysteriously, and the sorceries who had entered the castle. The prince asked her not to waste time looking for him or the magic necklace, as he would not be in the palace for some time. He also asked if she should not now prepare for the ball, because as planned, they were supposed to meet at the ball. The prince wrote that he would wait for her there, and at the same time he mentioned her real name. The moment she read the letter to the NY leading, she was taken aback because she realized that her identity was revealed. At last the day of the ball arrived, and the young lady was shining with beauty. She arrived at the imperial palace with an escort. Abby noticed that it was as magnificent as in her memories. She saw exquisite dishes surrounded by flowers. She saw aristocrats whose hems of dresses moved to the beat of the music. The court musicians enchanted with their compositions. Also present at the event was a young man who showed everyone his birds, and he claimed that they soar through everything. He, smiling, said that the aroma of freshly squeezed grapefruit, combined with pure white asters, like sprouts awakening after the rain, indicated that their love was just beginning. The young ladies looked at the birds with admiration and were amazed that even such information could be found out. At that very moment, the young ladies pounced on the young man, as some wanted to know their fate. Abby stared at the flowers that bloomed out of thin air. She didn't expect that the castle even had such a rare magical prop. Now she understood what her different choice of path had led her to. She saw that everything was radically different from her past life. Abby knew that if she had to choose, she would have preferred the Tower of the Magic Tree to beautiful decorations and clothes. But now she understood that she needed to find one person. She looked around for him, as she knew he should be at the banquet, but for some reason she couldn't find him. But at that very moment she froze, as she saw Carl at the banquet. After a moment, their eyes met. She quickly turned away, because she understood that she could not allow their eyes to meet at all. She wanted to show that she did not know him. Moment later, the imperial cheetah entered the hall, along with her youngest son. At that very moment, the servant informed the emperor that it was time to begin the banquet, but he also reported that the prince was not yet there. The emperor was furious. He immediately told everyone present that they would not wait for him and should begin without the prince. A moment later the banquet was opened. The young lady at the same time was watching everyone closely. She wondered if this was an ordinary ball. But a moment later she was taken aback, as she heard a loud roar, just like everyone else. She was a little surprised as she saw the prince with his retinue. The prince looked intently at the emperor and asked for forgiveness for being late. But at that very moment everyone was taken aback and looked at the prince in surprise and horror, as he was covered in blood. He walked slowly past the young ladies, and with a fierce grin, said that they did not need to worry, as he only had monster blood on him. At that very moment, the emperor angrily asked his subordinates where the guards were. He was beside himself with anger, and did not understand who allowed the prince to come to the ball in such a state, still holding a sword on Parivzi. But the prince only looked at the emperor with a fierce grin, without answering his question. Moment later, he knelt before the emperor, and reported that his order had been carried out, and the monsters near the city had been destroyed, and he also said that he had in no way dishonored the family. All those present were surprised, and puzzled that the prince had come in such a state, and they said that he had not shown the slightest respect to the emperor. The aristocrats whispered, as if they understood that the son and father really did not get along with each other. The young lady, in turn, watched everyone closely. A moment later the prince stood up and told the emperor that if he had nothing more to say, he would withdraw. The emperor, in turn, looked at his son with cold fury, but at that very moment he told his son with a grin that he knew very well that he worked hard, but this holiday was in his honor, and the nobles and ladies gathered here for his sake. He looked at his son with a grin, and said that before he left, he must dance at least one dance with the lady, in the very outfit in which he now appeared before everyone. Abby looked closely at everyone present. As she saw that the father and son looked more like enemies, she knew that the emperor had treated her son unfairly because he had brought a sword with him. The emperor, in turn, forced her to dance his dance, so that the prince had no choice. She understood that the prince was covered in blood, and therefore no lady would agree to dance. She assumed that such games had already happened more than once. At that very moment, the young lady, trembling with fear, looked at the prince. After all, her father had recently told her that she should become the future empress, but she could not do anything like that, since the prince's gaze frightened her to the point of trembling. The emperor looked at his son with a grin, and said that he was obliged to dance. The young man did not answer his father, but at that very moment he turned around and looked into the hall. The emperor was taken aback for a moment, and looked at his son in bewilderment. At that very moment, everyone was looking intently at the young lady who was sitting quietly in the corner. Abby was taken aback, and wondered if all eyes were on her. At that very moment, the prince handed his sword to his subordinate, and headed towards the young beautiful lady. Abby, in turn, was taken aback and hoped that he would not approach her, but to her regret, he still headed straight towards her. At that very moment, the prince bowed, and with a tender smile asked the young lady if she would like to dance with him. She understood that she shouldn't be the center of attention, but at that very moment, the prince extended his hand to her with a smile, and said that the necklace she was wearing had a red tint that suited her very well. She was taken aback because she did not understand why he suddenly mentioned the necklace. At that very moment, the necklace that she had recently lost popped into her head, He said with a smile that it was probably a gift from someone very important to her. The prince asked her with a smile to accept his offer first so that they could talk to her. Abby was taken aback, because she realized that this was clearly a threat on his part, and at that very moment she agreed to accept his offer. Abby was shocked, because she didn't expect the prince to ask her to dance. She didn't understand what was going on in his head. She realized that he had planned everything since he mentioned the necklace with which he openly threatened her, and if we take into account the previous letter, then he knew who she really was. But she also realized that this could be an attempt to test the waters. But the young lady had no intention of giving in to him, looked at her partner with a predatory grin, as she intended to trample him during the dance. Moment later they began to dance. Abby, in turn, was tired, and she was also puzzled, because no matter how much she tried to step on the prince's foot, he always eluded her. Abby knew it was easier to step on others when she didn't know the dance, but it was still hard to do it on purpose. She looked at the prince in surprise, as she had no idea that he danced so well. She looked at the prince in surprise, because this time, when they touched, she did not get an electric shock, like the last time. She wondered if it was because of the gloves. Abby also noticed during the dance that he did not force her, but only introduced her. But at that moment, she felt like a kite in the hands of the prince. At the same time, the emperor looked angrily at his son, as he was irritated that he had managed to get the girl after all. Maybe looked at the prince in surprise, as he, the son of Grace, introduced her to dancing. She was surprised as he caught her with ease. She was embarrassed as she saw all the stares that admired them. The prince looked at her with a smile, and said that he was not particularly happy with the current situation either, but he still asked if she would like to pay more attention to her partner. At that very moment, the young lady looked at the prince with resentment, but after a moment she stopped being offended by him, since she could not resist his beautiful face. She sighed heavily as all her anger subsided. He looked at her with a smile, and asked why she accepted his invitation in this situation. Babov, taken aback, and shouted that she accepted the offer because he invited her. He said she had the right to refuse, just like any other lady. He asked if she had agreed because of that red necklace. Abby looked at the prince with a tender smile, and said that everything was exactly so, because her brother gave her the necklace, but she could not even imagine who actually gave it to her. She said with a smile that for this reason, she should not have agreed to the dance, and besides, it was a great honor to dance with such a wonderful person like him. The prince smiled, and asked if that was really so. He looked at her with a smile, and said that she only needed to look into the eyes of all the noble persons who were afraid of him. He looked at her with a predatory smile, and said that she was not at all scared, which meant that she was not an ordinary lady. Abby looked at him intently, and said with a smile that in a sense he was right. The prince said that he heard that her mother was a great magician. Abby was taken aback, because she did not expect that they would talk about her mother. She looked at the prince with a smile, and said that it was true and her mother really was a good magician, but no one else in their family had a talent for such magic. No one but her had a talent for magic, so her words were not considered a lie. Wayne looked at her with a smile, and said that she was smarter and more intelligent than he had previously assumed. He smiled, and asked if this was their first meeting. At that moment, the young lady with a sly smile said that it was. A few minutes later she was taken aback as the music suddenly changed. The prince quietly leaned towards her, and said that this was the last composition. After everything was finished, Abby saw that everyone else had already left the dance floor, and this part was the final solo dance. She was very glad that it would soon be over. The young lady looked at her friend intently, and said that it would be very nice if the eldest prince held her hand now. Peggy looked at her friend angrily, as she did not want to listen to her sarcastic remarks. The young man looked at his companion, and asked with a smile what was going on there. Miss Carty, sipping her drink, sighed heavily, and said that a pack of dogs barked in the distance. But at that very moment she turned her gaze to the young man, who was smiling predator, ILY. A moment later, the birds that had previously entertained the guests rebelled. Everyone present at the banquet was puzzled. They did not know what was going on, as the romantic birds suddenly began to glow. A moment later the birds soared into the sky, and all the guests looked at the birds in bewilderment. The prince and his companion were distracted by the noise, but at that very moment the prince pushed his companion away, and said that she should stand behind him. The prince was puzzled. He did not know whether this was an enemy attack or not. At the same moment he was taken aback, as his companion said that the magic mechanism seemed to be in order. But moments later, they all saw that the birds had easily turned into a beautiful fireworks display. Labby was a little surprised as she saw the same rose petals as everyone else. Then she realized that the birds had revealed their magic, and the entire ballroom was filled with flowers. Everyone present was surprised, and looked at this spectacle with admiration. Abby noticed that the scent of roses filled the air. She knew it was a very impressive sight, and yet the nobles never stopped praising the magician. But looking at the prince, she wondered if this was his doing. At that very moment, the young man looked at the prince with a smile, and said with admiration that this spectacle was simply incredible. He smiled and said that the petals of roses falling from the sky, the flight of birds, love, the fragrance of the aroma, this is magic that dawns only when he meets his destiny. The young man said with a smile that they were destined to be together. The prince and his companion froze for a moment. Labby looked at the prince in surprise, not understanding what was going on at all. But at that very moment she caught the aristocrats' gazes on her. The emperor looked at them with fury and asked what was going on. At that very moment, the prince met his father's gaze. For some time they looked at each other angrily. Abby glanced sideways at everyone present, as she saw that they were already whispering among themselves. Wayne looked at his father intently and sighed heavily, saying that no matter what he answered, his father would stick to his opinion anyway, because his justifications were not important to the emperor at all. The emperor could not stand it, and lost his temper after his son's words. At that very moment he left the banquet hall. A moment later, the prince noticed a bird flying towards him. He looked closely at the mechanical bird, as he caught the tender gaze of his young companion. At that very moment, he handed the bird to the young lady. Wayne looked at his companion with a gentle smile, and said that the dance was already over, and that his task was completed, and he also thanked her for their first meeting. She looked at him with a smile, and said that he did not have to thank her, and she also said goodbye to him. As he left, he looked at her with a smile, and said that although she knew nothing about magic, she understood magical mechanisms. Abby stared intently at the departing prince, as he hinted that he was aware of her magical abilities. She knew that this night was most likely like a dream, because this night was filled with that events, but its consequences were not the only ones that spread throughout the area. After some time, the Duke shouted at his daughter, because he gave her a newspaper with news. He was burning with anger and fury, because he did not understand how she could miss such a wonderful opportunity, and at the same time she allowed the Camla family to take all the attention. The newspapers wrote that the lovebird brought a branch, and the roses blossomed. Everyone wanted to know if the prince and the young lady were really made for each other. The Duke looked at his daughter with anger, and asked if she was really glad that such gossip did not circulate about her. She was taken aback and asked for forgiveness, but at that very moment the man shouted at his daughter that she was nobody in society if no one talked about her. She was taken aback and could not utter a word. He shouted that the jewelry and her luxurious lifestyle were given to her by her family, so she had to repay the family. He said furiously that she should not forget that she chose Wayne herself, so she had to think about everything that was happening. The Duke was furious, as he knew that his daughter was just a good he is for her had nothing who had missed her opportunity to become attached to the prince, but he knew that he was not as incompetent as she. After the Duke left the room, the young lady burst into tears. She was furious because her rival had taken the prince away, and unable to bear her anger, she began to destroy everything that came to her hands. At that moment, the maid looked intently at her mistress, and said that she did not need to worry, as luck would not always be on their side. She looked at the lady with a predatory grin, and said that the louder the rumors, the more painfully they will fall. At the same time, work was in full swing in the Camla family's mine. Everyone was busy with their own business, but a moment later the man heard some noise. But to their regret, the noise was followed by a loud roar, and everyone clearly saw that the mine had collapsed. After some time, people finally managed to get out, but in the meantime there was chaos on the street. After some time, the young man saw the gentleman, who came to their rescue. Patrick looked at everyone present, as, to their dismay, the collapse had happened again. Some time later, Amber came to the prince, as he was looking for him. The prince sighed heavily, and told his comrade that he had been looking for him. He asked the young man to first look at the documents that were lying on the table. A moment later, the young man read that our mine had been attacked again, and that the perpetrator had committed suicide after blowing up the vein, leaving no trace. He was a little puzzled, but he knew that it was the Lyons family's doing again. At that very moment, the prince said that everyone knew it was the Duke, but while witnesses and evidence were disappearing, no one had been able to bring him to the case. Camla family's business was tied to precious stones, and relied heavily on rubies, and that several ruby veins had been attacked. He understood that they would have a hard time after that. The young man, with a grin, immediately said that it was very good that the Duke did not know about the existence of magic crystals. At that very moment, he saw another newspaper, in which a truly wonderful article was visible. Legend has it that the gods, not the destinies of the empire, shed a few tears and fell to the ground, turning into a human. Although they had never met before, their eyes fell on each other when they met a few days ago at a party. According to those present, at that moment, birds flew into the palace carrying roses, which symbolized love. Instantly blossomed around them, as if by magic, and then suddenly the voice of the goddess was heard, calling them a couple made in heaven. The prince sighed, and said that the newspaper was everywhere now, and everyone now knew that they were a match made in heaven. At that very moment, he looked at his comrade, and asked if he had really written the letter in his name. The prince was furious, for he saw that his companion had done several things after some suspicions had arisen, that the guest was Miss Camless, since it was Amber who had given the necklace to the young lady's brother, and written the letter to secure her presence at the ball. And then he became a magician for the holidays, and it all ended with the lovebirds appearing during their dance. Wayne looked at his comrade, and said that these rumors about them were everywhere now. Amber screamed and called for his master. The prince looked at the young man with a smirk, and said that it seemed like he simply intended to make his contract with the great family more intimate, but he knew that there was no need to incur the emperor's disdain, as he had eventually turned the partnership based on magic stones into a marriage-based bond. He sighed heavily, because he knew that the brave girl who danced with him at the ball covered in blood was destiny, and this rhetoric would be enough for them to get closer, and then they could get closer to her family. He sighed heavily, and said that his admiration for the young lady could have been lessened. The prince was very angry with his comrade, since he acted not only independently, but also without his knowledge. Wayne looked closely at his comrade, and asked if he really didn't even think that he could anger him, and would be punished when the truth came out. Amber smiled, and told the prince that he relied on the trust between a ruler and his subordinate. He knew that the prince had a soft side. He told the prince that even though he was opposing the emperor, he still had no intention of harming the innocent present. He sighed heavily, and told the prince that even though his path led to the abyss, he must cast aside his doubts. Amber shouted that the emperor was treating his son worse, and worse every day, so they were running out of time. He said that was the reason he included it in the necklace chain. Because of this, the young lady took the invitation as a test, and accepted his request. Amber said with a grin that future rumors would become their spear and shield. He looked intently at the gentleman, and said that the next meeting would be initiated with the duke's family. At that very moment, someone knocked on their door to the office. The young man entered the prince's office, and announced that he had received a very important letter. A moment later, the prince began to read this important letter. He sighed heavily after reading, and told his friend that he was truly a genius, because he had received an invitation to the Camla family estate. At that very moment, Amber, with a satisfied smile, told the prince that this was exactly what he had expected, and that was why everything had happened as he had said. At that moment, the prince smiled, and told his friend that in that case he should be rewarded. Wayne looked at Wirelin with a predatory smile, and said that he should take Amber to the order so that he could train there. Amber was taken aback at that moment, as he hated this type of activity more than anything else. At that very moment, he shouted to the prince that he promised him never to do anything like that again without his knowledge. The prince looked after the young man with a satisfied smile, and said that after this he would count on him much more. After some time, the young lady sat quietly in her room, and felt sad. Unfortunately, the young lady was unable to learn anything new about Carl. She was puzzled, because she also failed to return the lost necklace, but her name was in all the newspaper headlines. She was in shock, wondering if she was really such a loser. Abby was well aware of the fact that all this happened because she took a different path, one she knew little about. She thought for a moment, and wondered if she would fail again, and be reborn into this mess. Abby sighed heavily and wondered if she should just give in. She had been for a while. At that very moment, a maid burst into her room, and joyfully announced that Master Aaron had returned. Abby was taken aback, and asked her maid in fear what she had just said. The maid told the lady with a joyful smile that Master Aaron had already been to the estate with a large gift. Looks are a way to show care for each other. Abby knew her father's were wide and reserved. The older brother's hugs were warm and caring, and the second brother's were suffocating. He looked at his sister with a smile, and asked for forgiveness, as he forgot himself a little. Aaron, with a satisfied smile, told his sister that he really wanted to see her, so he could not contain his emotions. Her older brother Aaron was something of an exception. As for literacy, by the age of 8 he could retell the entire code. In terms of mastery of wrestling, he was on the same level as his elder brother, and he was even more agile when compared to them. The butler looked at the gentleman with a smile, as he was very fast, but he did not seek power, and did not take on the family responsibility of serving in the palace, as his brother Patrick did. Instead, he did all sorts of weird and wonderful things while his father turned a blind eye. Aaron looked at his father with a smile, and said that he could continue to do his business while he slightly renovated his office, but the Duke sometimes did not hold back, and shouted at his son, and, unfortunately, he was very concerned about this behavior of his son. Aaron looked at his sister with a gentle smile, and informed her that he had brought a lot of things this time, so she should wait a little while, and he would show her everything. The young lady, in turn, looked with a joyful smile at her brother, who was happily communicating with the servants and distributing gifts to them. She was glad, because they really hadn't seen each other for a long time. Abby knew that in her past life, she had to wait for months to see her beloved brother again. But a moment later, she was taken aback as he presented her with a small box. Aaron looked at his sister with a smile and asked if she wanted to open it. Abby was surprised because she saw a music box ball. She saw that the snowflakes did not melt and fell to the music in front of her was a truly magical mechanism. He looked at her with a satisfied smile and, using a pompous speech, told her how much he had overcome on his way, but still managed to get his hands on such an exotic item. She looked at him with a smile and said that he had given her a truly wonderful gift. He looked away from her and asked if she liked the gift. At that very moment, the outlines, with a joyful smile, told her brother that she liked him very much. Aaron smiled and said that he could now breathe a sigh of relief. At that very moment, the young lady became sad, because she knew that her brother was always thinking about her, but she, unfortunately, was not so attentive to him. At that very moment, she grabbed her brother by the hand and said that they should go to the same place. Abby said with a smile that she also had a small gift for her brother. The young man was surprised, as he did not expect to hear something like that. At that very moment, she used her power in front of her brother. He looked at his sister with surprise and admiration and asked if she had really used magic. She smiled and said nothing, but asked her brother to open it. Aaron stood frozen for a moment as he read the small note, for his sister hoped that he would be safe and sound and would always do what his beautiful soul asked of him. He looked at her tenderly, as her words were a comfort to him. Abby looked at her brother with a smile and said that it was not easy for a father, as the head of the family, to show his support, even if he was worried about his children, but she was not like that. She said with a smile that she intended to support him always and in everything. He looked at his sister with a smile and said that she should also follow her heart, because he knew that she really wanted to become a great magician. She smiled and said that, of course, that would be the case. After receiving the gift from his sister, he felt like the happiest man on earth, and nothing should spoil his mood. But after some time he was burning with rage and anger, because he saw the newspaper. He asked his relatives what had happened, since he had left for only a few months, and when he arrived, his sister was already being married off. Was furious because he knew that his sister was still too young for such a thing, as she was only 15 years old. Patrick looked at his brother and sighed heavily, saying that the information about their newspapers was just gossip that changed every day. At that very moment, he told his father that he had already dealt with the damage to the mine and the victims. Aaron was furious. He couldn't understand how his family could be so calm. He couldn't understand the superficial information in their newspapers. He wanted to know what really happened. The Duke sighed heavily and said that they would talk about the incident later, and that there was no need to worry about the young lady, as she had already reached marriageable age. Aaron sighed heavily and said, puzzled, that they could talk about marriage now. He said that after the wedding she would leave them. He said that they would only be able to watch from her new home as she laughed and had fun with a strange man. And then, they will come home and sit at the table in the cold night, with two stinking men eating cold food and drinking cold water. His family looked at him with puzzlement, as they had not expected anything like this at all. The Duke sighed heavily and asked his son what his opinion was on the matter. At that very moment, the young man shouted that his sister could not get married. He wanted her to be independent and self-sufficient, and he also shouted that he could take care of her in any case. The Duke looked at his son and said in a calm manner that his sister had told him herself that she wanted to fulfill her family obligations and that she considered the prince handsome. He also told his son that if he had a solution, then instead of complaining, it would be better for him to do something about it. Patrick looked at his brother closely and told him to deal with their sister as soon as possible, because the prince was supposed to come to them today. Aaron was seething with anger and fury. He couldn't understand how the prince had the nerve to come and meet their family. At the same moment, he said that the young lady thought the prince was not bad, but either she saw too little of him. His family looked at him in surprise, as they did not understand what he was talking about, but at that very moment he shouted that his decision was to send her on a blind date. He said that he would certainly provide her with many young, attractive, decent, modest people. He shouted that he just wanted her to see that no man could be good. Sometime later, the young people visited a luxury hotel, because Aaron's level of indignation reached its maximum, and even her breath caught in moments. Therefore the young lady agreed with her brother, and after some time they check each young man. Aaron looked closely at the young man and asked him for all the information. The young man smiled and introduced himself and also assured the young lady that she would be happy in marriage with him because he was a hardworking, persistent man who made a living from his craft. Aaron quietly told his sister that the young man had paid off his family's debts through hard work, but now owed a lot of money himself due to gambling, and Abby was shocked by what she heard. After some time, they invited the next candidate. Aaron looked closely at the handsome young man and asked him to tell him about his strengths and weaknesses. The young man smiled and stated that his strengths as an Imperial Knight train were honesty, strength, and the desire to take even the most minor tasks seriously. At that very moment, Aaron quietly told his sister that the young man still lived with his father, and if she married him, she would be babysitting two men. The next candidate, with tears in his eyes, said that he had experienced many herbs, but all of this had become an unforgettable experience in his life. Aaron quietly told his sister that the young man had been married several times and had been accused of bigamy, which is why he had even been arrested. The next candidate, in turn, said that he hoped to find the person with whom he was destined to be for the rest of his life. Aaron whispered to his sister with a grin that this young man only liked men. He looked at his sister intently and said that she didn't know anything about men. After some time, a young man came to them for a viewing. Sterling Carty apologized to them in advance for being late. Abby was taken aback for a moment as she saw a handsome young man. Abby looked closely at her brother and asked if the young man was coming from a family with which their own family had business relations. Her brother said with a smile that it was so, because the young man was the son of a marquis. The young man was also a jeweler in the service of the imperial family, with a good character and harmless habits. Sterling said that he was very glad that Mr. Aaron liked him. At that very moment, Evie quietly asked her brother what was wrong with the young man. Aaron quietly said that he checked everything and the young man had no problems. She looked at him in surprise and asked why he had called him then. He was taken aback, but said that he wanted to show her that I couldn't find a horn and that there were plenty of all sorts of servants on the street. She froze in place in shock, as she did not expect this, but after a few minutes she sighed heavily and asked him to stop. Abby looked at the young man closely and apologized for taking his time to come to them, but she informed him that today's blind date was just an impulsive decision and she wanted to send him a gift later as an apology. At that very moment, Abby informed the young people that she would now like to speak with her brother alone. The young man bowed and said with a smile that it had been a great honor for him to meet her, but without any hard feelings he decided to leave. Abby looked closely at her brother and asked him to tell her what really happened at their home. The young man looked away from her and said that he did not understand at all what she was talking about. She sighed heavily and said that she was not a naive girl at all, since she knew that such an outrageous matchmaking must be done with the tacit consent of her older brother and father. The young man backed away and looked away from his sister, but she looked at him menacingly and called out. He sighed heavily and said that everything was correct, and both his brother and father should have taken part in such important family matters, and not him. The young lady agreed with him. Looking away from her brother, she said that, as he had said earlier, the most important thing for her now was to understand what the men were like, and with so much precious time with their brother, she should have treated his chosen candidates better, so she suggested starting from the very beginning. He sighed heavily and said that everything was fine, and there was no need to worry. At that very moment, he looked at his sister and told her that their family's ruby mines had been blown up. She was taken aback, as she had not expected such a thing at all. Abby looked at her brother with a worried look and asked whose handiwork this was. Aaron sighed heavily and said that they didn't know yet who was behind all of this, but their father suspected that the Lyons family did it. As far as she understood, several of their most important homes had been destroyed, and she knew that their business would be seriously damaged if the mines were blown up, so they would have no financial support, and the title would become a dummy, and the family would be swallowed up by someone. Abby wondered if this would make her disappear, but now she understood what her father and brother wanted to resolve. She knew that they would not arrange a meeting with the Lyons family otherwise. They would scare away the snake and would not get any evidence. That's why they wanted to meet the crown prince. Abby knew that this made sense, because the rumors about them would make their meeting go more smoothly and not attract attention. At that very moment, the young lady quickly stood up and went out. Her brother was worried and did not understand where she was going, but she immediately announced that she was heading home. Aaron was worried because he had promised his father and brother that he would keep her outside the whole day, not a minute less. Hugged his sister tightly and said that she couldn't go home now. At that very moment, a young man entered their room. They looked at the unexpected guest in bewilderment. In turn, she was taken aback and froze for a moment as she saw Carl in front of her. She asked her brother in surprise if this was another candidate for a blind date. He was a little confused and said that it was probably true, since he had reserved places for the whole day today, but he didn't know about this guest. Abby looked at her brother and asked how long she should be out of the house. He sighed heavily and said that she should walk for about half an hour, since by now their father's meeting should be over. The lady, looking at her brother, said that she would not return home, but she would like to talk to this candidate alone. Aaron looked at his sister in surprise, as he did not expect this. After some time, the young lady sat quietly with her companion, and there was an awkward atmosphere between them. Abby looked closely at the young man. She knew that it was definitely Carl in front of her, but she didn't know how to talk to him, since theoretically they hadn't met yet. At that very moment, he asked if he really needed to state his name, gender, age, and occupation. He looked at her with a satisfied grin and said that his name was Carl. He was 15 years old, and he was the second prince, and in the future he would become the ruler of the empire. She was taken aback and wondered if he had buried the memory of the past. He looked at the young lady with a predatory grin and said that he would be an emperor in this life too. She looked at him intently, but did not answer, because she realized that he was also reborn, just like her. She had thought about this before, but now all her thoughts were confirmed. She supposed that her desire had attracted the attention of the goddess, who had missed her gaze, but her pity was unclear. After all, she could do it by inhaling, or she could refuse to change the course of time, and only for her alone. Abby assumed that she was reincarnated, because she was in a magic circle, and the huge amount of magical power could bring her back. But looking at the prince, she assumed that it was not only she who had returned to the past. It seemed to her that he had gone through the same thing as she had, and perhaps that was how he had received a new life. At that very moment, he said that he had not come to her for a date. She breathed a sigh of relief. He looked at her with a grin and said that she had sneaked into the palace earlier. Carl asked if she really intended to kill him. He looked with a smirk at the young lady, who did not answer him, and said that in her place he would have done the same. After all, in front of her now was the criminal who had destroyed the world. Abby looked at the young man with a sharp and angry look, and said that now she knew everything. She asked if he really thought that she would also help him ascend to the throne. He shouted at the prince that he did not need to create illusions for himself, because in this life all her family members were alive, and her hatred was a thing of the past. She also said that he was not at all suitable for this position, and even if he had any offers, she would still refuse him. He looked at her closely, asking if she really thought she had control over her life. Carl said that she had failed to prevent the decline of the family, and the power of the Lyons and Khalid families was growing stronger. He said that so far, the events were no different from the past life. But Carl said that this was just the tip of the iceberg, because in his opinion, she never had the right to choose, because the goddess of fate had already put the clasp at the end, and they were all just pawns in her hands, and no matter how hard she tried, the end was already predetermined. He also told the young lady that he intended to become emperor again, and that this world would fall again. The young lady could not stand it, and angrily asked what kind of nonsense he was talking about. At that very moment, she stood up and used her magic, as she wanted to decide everything here and now. He looked at her with a smirk and said that she could kill him here and now, but her family would not have a happy ending. The young lady could not resist and directed a stream of her magic at the young prince. But at that very moment she was taken aback, because she saw a brooch on the prince and realized that it was a magical item. He closed his eyes, looked at her, and asked if she was really curious about me, since this brooch was made of a magic crystal. He said that this could be of great importance even to ordinary people, and the destruction of the mines was not enough to overthrow an established family, and the reason for its demise was that the wealth fell into the wrong hands. He also said that a huge amount of magical stones were buried under the mines. At that moment, Abby looked closely, but the prince alone did not answer. She sighed heavily and thanked him for the information, but she had no intention of helping him after that. She said that there must be someone who is better suited for the throne than him. Carl asked with a smirk if she meant his brother. He knew it was true, because his brother was handsome and good, not given to emotions. Carl, smiling, said that his brother was kind, generous, friendly, decisive in killing without hesitation, good in battle, capable of defeating at least 100 enemies. Abby looked at the prince with bewilderment, as it seemed to her that he liked Wayne more than she did. He eclipsed the computer, looked at her, and said that if she helps his brother ascend to the throne, then he will voluntarily give up this race. He smirked and asked if it wouldn't be better for her, because the story would be completely different. The young lady was taken aback for a moment and looked at him in bewilderment. She sighed heavily and said that she would think about it, and that they would finish their conversation for today. As she left, she asked why he had created that sacrificial circle in his past life. After all, she knew that he had everything. Carl in turn sighed heavily and said sadly that he did not remember this. Initially, he just wanted to test and see her reaction. But now he realized that something was tender, but to his regret, something very important he could not remember. Sometime later, the young lady and her brother were returning back. Aaron looked at his sister with alarm and asked if something had happened, since she hadn't said a word the entire journey. She looked at him with a smile and said that she was just thinking about the blind dates that her brother had set her up on. She said that he didn't even have a partner, and he was putting him in an awkward position, his own sister. Abby knew the good news was that all was not lost. She didn't know what I really wanted, Carl, but the information that he had memories was enough for her, and she was even glad that he gave her valuable information. Some time later, they finally arrived at the right place, but noticed that something was wrong. The lady asked her brother in surprise if anyone had already decided to talk outside. At that very moment, Aaron said that the meeting was originally scheduled for the daytime, but due to business, the prince postponed it until the evening. The prince looked intently at the duke and apologized for being late. At that very moment he turned around and looked at the young lady with a tender smile. Abby was surprised, but she also realized that they had met anyway, no matter how much her family wanted to shield her from the meeting. The prince looked at the duke intently and apologized for being late as he had received urgent orders that I had to complete. The duke asked if he had been exterminating monsters. Wayne looked at the duke intently and said that this was indeed the case, as they were now more rowdy than usual, and this was not a good sign. Moment later they walked into the room, and the duke, looking at the young prince, said that this was their first official meeting. The prince looked intently at the duke and said that everything was correct. A moment later, there was an awkward silence between them. The duke looked closely at the prince, as his calmness was a little relaxing. He assumed that the prince did not yet know about magic crystals. The duke knew that at this point, this was the man most likely to work with their family and still grant them a royal mining license. The duke understood that the delicate relationship with Abby could also become a reason for contact between the parties. He understood that his family had been forced into a marriage with the prince because it was in decline, and such a union was easier to accept when the parties were united by their interests. However, he was really afraid of him. He knew about what he had done at the ball, so the duke assumed that this was not the best candidate for a husband. He knew that his daughter would tell him with a joyful smile that she and the prince would be together. He could already imagine how she joyfully said goodbye to them, and said that she would definitely be happy with the prince. But at that very moment, he realized that everything would definitely not be so, because he knew what the prince was really like, and assumed that he would simply take his daughter away with a joyful grin on his face. The prince looked at the duke in bewilderment, as he saw that he was burning with rage. The prince was a little puzzled, and did not know how to start the conversation. The duke sighed heavily, for he knew that they must begin the conversation with the collapse of the mine. He sighed heavily and told the prince that he thought he already knew what was going on with their family, but he didn't have time to finish, and the prince said that he only came to them because of the young lady. The duke froze in shock. The prince knew that everything was true, and he came to them only because of the young lady. He knew that the ultimate goal of the negotiations would be to resolve the issue of the magic crystal mine, but this was only the first meeting. Wayne knew that the most important thing was to be able to justify the need to continue the contract. He understood that if the duke refused him in marriage, he would save the young lady's reputation, and for both of them, there was a good reason to maintain contact. Wayne said that he fell in love with the young lady at first sight and came to ask for her hand in marriage. At that moment, the duke could not bear it any longer, and angrily asked the prince what he had just said. The prince understood that this scene had to end with a refusal. It seemed to him that the duke understood him, but in reality he was too angry to recognize the hint. The duke was burning with rage. He understood that there would be no negotiations with the prince if he had plans for his daughter. At this time, the young lady was eavesdropping on the conversation with her magic. She was a little surprised about the engagement, but she knew it was a good idea. Bea knew that if she were the prince's fiancée, the investigation would be much easier. She remembered that Carl himself had said that he wanted her to help his brother ascend to the throne, and Abby knew that now was the right time for Togo to do so and change the course of history forever. Besides, she understood that if she was closer to Carl, she would be able to control him. The prince looked at the duke intently and asked with a smile if he didn't want Abby to have a good home. The Duke was burning with rage and anger because he didn't want to give his daughter to anyone. The young lady understood that the situation was very difficult, as her father was furious. Wayne looked at the Duke and said that it would be a union of the strongest, and that was the preferred option for noble marriages, and he did not think the Duke could have found a better candidate. The Duke looked at the young man with fury and said that he would not allow his daughter to marry for convenience. The prince assured the Duke that this was not at all the case. The Duke sighed heavily and, as he left, said that they had nothing more to talk about, and so they would end it here for today. But at that very moment, they were taken aback as they heard a knock on the door. The young lady came into my room with a smile and told my father that they could be heard throughout the house. She said that since they were deciding such important issues, she would like to express her opinion on the matter. The Duke was taken aback, as he did not expect such a thing. At that very moment she looked at the prince with a smile and greeted him. She bowed low and asked him to promise to protect her family. She said with a smile that if he did not mind, she agreed to accept his proposals. The prince looked at the young lady in surprise, as he did not expect such a thing. At that very moment, she said with a smile that she agreed to be engaged to him. The Duke was shocked. He knew he was about to have a heart attack from what he heard and saw. Some time later, the prince sat in his castle and thought about his next steps. He looked closely at his comrades and reported that after the conversation with the Duke, the young lady was already leading the conversation. The young lady, in turn, really wanted to talk to her father, but she saw that he was unhappy with the situation. She looked at him closely and said that he never drank cold black tea, but this cup had been standing on the table for half an hour, and he had not touched it once. She sighed heavily and said that if he wanted to tell her something, he should say it directly. The Duke was a little puzzled. He sighed heavily and said that it was difficult to keep his daughter when she got older. She looked at him in bewilderment, as she could see from the outside that this marriage did not look like a real one. She looked at her father with a smile and said that if he meant the prince, she thought he was a good candidate. Wayne looked closely at his subordinates and asked whether they were happy or not. The young people were taken aback for a moment, as they did not expect such a question, but they still asked what happened next. He sighed heavily and said that the young lady said that he was a perfect match for their family in terms of birth and appearance, but most importantly, they all found themselves in a terrible situation, and the prince seemed to stand alone on the edge of the tide and drown at the first push. But if you learn to control the waves behind you, you will be able to drown all your enemies. She said that he was capable of helping them, but he himself needed help. Abby told her father that the prince was exactly the man they needed. Abby sighed heavily and told her father that what had happened was no ordinary disaster, like what had happened to her brothers, but that they had written it. She was very worried that they might be in danger. The Duke was puzzled. He told his daughter that he would always protect her. She looked closely at her beloved father and said that she knew about it, but she still wanted to do her part too. She smiled tenderly and said that if this exchange of interests really led to a good future for their family, then it would be worth it. The Duke was taken aback and froze in place in surprise, as he had not expected anything like this from his daughter. Prince sighed heavily, and looking at his comrade, asked him to arrange a meeting with the young lady. He also said that he still had a necklace that should be returned to the young girl. Wayne looked at his comrades and said that all the nobles, including the emperor, must know about his last meeting with the Duke. Amber looked at the prince with a satisfied grin and said that he would make all the news public. The prince was pleased with what had happened, as he now awaited the next move from his enemies. Some time later, the man visited the Duke's residence and showed off his new wedding outfit. He smiled contentedly and praised the outfit, its luxurious fabric, and its excellent pattern. The young man thought for a moment, and looking at the outfit, noticed that it was really not bad. Patrick looked closely at the maid and told her to tell the merchant to keep the outfit, regardless of the price. At that very moment, the young lady came out to her brother with a smile and asked what he was looking at so intently. Patrick smiled and said that some of the minor nobles who visited them and just guests came and recommended their own goods. They all came to them because they heard about the engagement between her and the prince. Abby looked out the window in surprise as she noticed a very long line. Patrick sighed heavily and said that the head of their family had met with the crown prince, and such news could not be hidden. And what's more, their story had become the subject of a great deal of hype. He sighed heavily and said that it was not the best people who were involved in this. He looked closely at his sister and said that this was even worse than a well-armed enemy, and that what was most frightening was the knives hidden between the glasses. He looked at her sharply and said that she would have to deal with this on her own again. She smiled and asked what had happened to her brother, whether the minister's job was really that hard. He smiled and said that he was always dragged to unnecessary lectures. Moments later, he handed her a letter and told her that she had to make her own decision. Abby froze in place for a moment, in surprise as her brother presented her with a letter from a young lady. She was a little surprised and puzzled, as Peggy was inviting her to tea. Patrick looked at her intently and said with a smile that it was a lot of trouble and asked why she didn't just pretend to be sick. Abby sighed heavily and said that wasn't a bad idea. But in turn, she was a little worried about the magic machine. The flow of magical machines meant a flow of magical crystals. She understood that she had to go and check everything. After some time, the young lady did attend the tea party, but she was a little puzzled, as she saw that she really was not liked by all the ladies present, but she was a little puzzled and golden, as she saw that they had completely lost their fear, because she was right in front of them. We and the girls did not hide their contempt and rudeness. They heard that she had made a laughing stock of herself with her indecent behavior. Lottie glared at the girls but didn't answer. It all started with a few absurd solo rumors, but now it has all grown into a political intrigue. She was forced to dance with Wayne, and he himself supported these shameless rumors. These lies were deliberately passed from mouth to mouth, and eventually many people believed them. The lady looked at Abby with a smirk and said that she was obviously a strange recluse, so it was impossible to tell right away how calculating she was. Abby looked at the young lady with fury and wondered if they were waiting for her to make a mistake and confirm the rumors. They said that she was, after all, the daughter of a great family, but they knew that the girl, like the lion and Kala families, they had the same status. And besides, the noble families of Kamla did not marry commoners. They said that it was shameless for the young lady to take advantage of this to rise up and tarnish the reputation of His Highness the Crown Prince. Abby glared at the girls but didn't answer. Hay mocked her, saying that Mrs. Peggy was much more suitable for the role of Crown Princess. At that moment, a young lady joined them and said that she had heard that her uncle had visited the Duke of Lyons again. Yesterday she asked with a smile whether it was because of the trouble at the sawmill that they had not met. She wanted to know whether they had flattered Peggy for their own benefit. The girl was taken aback and said that this, of course, was not true, because she simply wished with all her heart that Mrs. Peggy would become the bride of the Crown Prince. The lady smiled and said that sincerity meant less talk and more action. At that very moment, she turned her attention to young Abby Lily and introduced herself with a smile, and told the young lady that they had met before at the jewelry store. Abby thought for a moment, as she remembered the girl who had been with Peggy last time. Lillian looked at the young lady with a smile, and informed her that the minor aristocrats were not known for their foresight, and all they could do was gossip behind their backs. She told Abby with a smile that they said she was strange, but it was their caustic appearance that made communication difficult. Abby was a little surprised by such words, since she knew that the girl was definitely Peggy's friend. She did not understand why she suddenly decided to talk to her. Lily Ann looked at the young lady with a smile, and said that she should not worry so much, as in fact she came to apologize for Peggy, because the girl was always so reckless and hostile to others, because of her father's desire to make his daughter the wife of the Crown Prince. Lily Ann, burning with rage, said that the easiest way, of course, was to become the wife of Crown Prince Wayne, but she thought that Abby was more suitable for the role of Crown Princess. Abby, in turn, was surprised by such a statement and said, "Young lady," that she was exaggerating. Lillian looked closely at her new acquaintance and said that she was not exaggerating at all, because she believed that everything was exactly like that. Looking at Abby, she said that it seemed to her that she was absolutely his type, and even if she herself did not realize the obvious, it was so. Sometime later, the tea ceremony began. Lolly Ann looked at the young lady with a smile and asked her to sit next to her, as she intended to introduce her to the other ladies. Abby was a little surprised, and at the same time wary, as she saw that her new acquaintance was very friendly, considering that she was part of the Collade family and a friend of Peggy. Lillian looked at her endowment with a smile and asked her to pay attention to something interesting. Obi thought for a moment, since she should have met her in her past life, but she did not remember them crossing paths anywhere. Lillian smiled and told Abby that the girl sitting on the left was the young Marchioness of Ponto, and it would be better for her not to get involved with the girl on the right. The young lady looked at them in surprise and asked if they were really talking about her now. Lillian screamed and called the young lady. At that very moment, she told the girl with a smile that she should not speak without thinking first. Abby was a little puzzled, as she saw that the tea party hadn't even started yet, and there was already a mess around. She wondered what would happen when Peggy showed up. At that very moment, everyone clearly saw the young lady. She looked at everyone present with a smile and said that she was late. At that very moment, everyone looked with admiration at the young lady's outfit and wondered if there were real flowers in it. The Marquise looked at the young lady with a smile and asked if it was from the master who had sewn the coronation dress for the Empress. At that very moment, Peggy looked at the Marquise with a smile and said that she had an eye for this kind of beauty. She was pleased that they praised her, since today she wanted to show them the difference between her and the new girl in society. But at the same time, Peggy paid no attention to their conversations and was enjoying the wonderful dessert. Peggy was burning with rage and anger, and she wanted the young guest to turn her attention to her. At that very moment, She showed off a beautiful fan with a smile, which no one had ever had before, because she wanted the girl to look at it. Everyone looked at her exquisite fan with surprise and admiration. As they saw the relief oriental embroidery, which was truly incredible, they all wanted to take a closer look at such an attractive beauty. The girls joyfully and admiringly mentioned that she was wearing a beautiful floral dress today, and also had a beautiful flower fan with her, and, most likely, Anna did all this for the festival of the goddess of flowers, because the festival was supposed to be soon. The young lady said with a smile that this was not so, and she had prepared everything for a tea party, not for a holiday, but she did prepare one thing for the flower goddess festival. At that very moment, she asked the maid to bring and show something. A moment later, she looked at everyone present with a smile, and said that today, in order to show what her father had given her, she had gathered everyone. She showed everyone with a smile the beautiful magical mechanism, which was made by the same hand as the romantic bird, and in front of them now was a real amphora flora. In the empire, young girls were always associated with flowers, the goddess of flowers. The flora wake in the dark lands, and they sprouted lush, beautiful flowers. It was the goddess who brought life and beauty into this world. The girls put on wreaths and danced, illuminated by the rays of the sun, and at the same time, they thanked the goddess for this gift from God. The young ladies happily said that every year, they looked forward to the festival of the goddess of flowers. After all, this holiday was solemn, romantic, and extremely important. Since the streets were decorated with flowers, the apparatus passed through the entire city. Starting from the palace, everyone around was having fun, no matter what. Beautiful ladies could also meet a handsome young man on their way and fall in love with him, because from time immemorial, the famous empress brought lush blossoms on the day of the goddess of flowers. All their husbands were wise rulers for their people. The lady sighed heavily and said that, however, none of the current emperor's 3 wives seemed to have such an ability. At that very moment, she was taken aback, because she realized that she should not have said such a thing. Lolly Ann looked closely at the young lady, and said with a smile that nothing terrible had happened, that she had said something like that, because the sister empress was really not capable of such a thing. Abby was taken aback for a moment, because she knew that Lolly Ann belonged to the Collide family. Lolly Ann said with a smirk that she had also heard that a girl who allowed flowers to wither on the festival of the goddess of flowers would bring disaster to the country. The young ladies, in turn, were taken aback and froze in surprise, looking at those present. She looked at everyone present with a smile, and asked why they were looking at her so intently, since it was just a question out loud. She looked closely at her friend and asked if the flora amphora could be tested for its ability to induce flowering. Peggy said with a smile that they could just put a twig in the vase and find out the answer themselves. The lady looked at everyone present with a smile and asked if anyone wanted to try. Lolly Ann looked at her new friend with a smile and said that she thought this was a unique opportunity. She took one small branch and, approaching the beautiful amphora, said that they could simply put the branch and that would be it. But after she did the same thing herself, they noticed that nothing happened. They smiled, because they didn't know what to answer to something like that. Lillian breathed a sigh of relief, and said that she already knew that she was not cut out to be a queen. Abby looked at the girl closely, and told her that she shouldn't be upset as it was just a little test. Lolly Ann looked at her with a smile, and said that they should try it too. The young ladies, in turn, wanted to test something similar, and they began to put branches into the amphora one by one, but nothing happened. The young lady looked at Mrs. Peggy and asked why she didn't try. Peggy smiled and said that she hadn't really tried it, so she wanted to try her luck. A moment later she tried her luck and the beautiful flowers bloomed and simply came to life. All the ladies present praised her with joy, as they saw that it was simply a miracle, the goddess of flowers. Peggy smiled and said that she hadn't even expected such a result, but in fact, everything had been planned for a long time. Everyone was a little surprised that the young lady had the ability to bloom, but some did not understand what was surprising about this ability. Lollian said with a smile that she had heard that many magicians had the ability to control the elements, such as fire or water, but not everyone is able to control life magic, such as making flowers bloom. The lady looked closely at her new acquaintance and asked if she wanted to try it. Abby was a little surprised as she didn't expect that. The young lady looked at her with a gentle smile and said that she should try it too. A moment later, Abby followed the lead of her new acquaintances and decided to try a similar experiment. A moment later they all saw beautiful roses. Lillian smiled, because she could not even think that her new acquaintance would also be able to easily control such an element. But at that very moment, the young lady shouted for them to look at the roses. Everyone was surprised and at the same time shocked, as they saw that all the flowers had withered. The young ladies looked in horror at the flowers that were slowly crumbling, Lalian was taken aback and looked at her new acquaintance in surprise, as she did not expect such a thing. A moment later, an awkward atmosphere rose between everyone present. Lilian looked at the young lady sharply and said that she need not be upset as it was just a test, and she could not really be cursed. The girls looked at the young lady with a sharp and angry look, as they knew that this thing was created by the same person as the birds. They wondered if this was a fake, then could they claim that she and the prince were made for each other? They sarcastically told her that the crown prince was deceived. Peggy looked at everyone present with a fierce grin, as she wanted them to continue their guesses. Abby looked at everyone present with a smile, and said that she didn't think that things would turn out like this. She told Peggy that she was very sorry, but it seemed that her device was broken, but she would take responsibility and fix everything. It is true that only a few people have control over the magic that made the flowers bloom, and if anyone else had fallen for this trick, they could have been in a very difficult situation. Abby knew that her reputation would be tarnished, and everyone would turn against her, but she was a great sorceress, and simply could not allow such an outcome. Moments after casting their magic, they all froze as they saw beautiful new flowers. The lovely ladies were shocked, because they could not believe what they saw. Abby smiled and said that, as before, the special function of this magical mechanism was activated for her, because as soon as she touched the bottom of the amphora, it was indeed signed, just like the romantic birds. She said with a smile that this master was simply something. Everyone present froze in shock. They didn't know what to answer her. Abby looked at the lovely ladies with a smile and said that it was too late, so she thanked them for the invitation and decided to take her leave. Everyone looked at her in surprise and intently, as they were stunned by what they saw. At the same time, the young lady looked angrily at her competitor. She could not bear it any longer and in anger threw the amphora on the ground, and it broke. A few days later, the merchant presented the emperor with the best treasure he had managed to find abroad. The emperor looked at all the goods with a satisfied grin and said that he accepted everything, and he also let the merchant go. The young man looked closely at the emperor and said that these precious stones were very similar to the eyes of Lady Imari. The emperor looked at the young man with a grin and said that he was very smart. The young man smiled and said that, after all, the emperor has been doting on her lately. The emperor sighed heavily and asked his subordinate what the crown prince was doing now. The young man smiled and said that the crown prince had gone to the duke's residence again, but he had not even allowed him to see the duchess. The emperor sighed heavily and said that Kamla was nothing more than an unknown who disgraced the nobility. He understood how a man who seemed to have nothing, even blood soaked, to dare to resist him could suddenly fall into love at first sight. The emperor was furious, as he realized that his son simply took him for an idiot. The emperor knew that Prince Wayne had seen Kamla Kayak as a civilian, and apparently she, too, bestowed favor upon the crown prince. The young man said with a grin that they couldn't know, but perhaps this woman was the one the crown prince was partial to. The emperor snorted a lot, but said nothing. Some time later, the maid happily ran to her mistress and presented her with a whole mountain of letters. She really hoped that her mistress had received new invitations to tea. Abby was a little puzzled, as she knew that after the last tea party, all sorts of invitations had rained down on her like snowflakes. She was very tired and didn't want anything. She sighed heavily and said that she had already publicly declared that she was ill, so she could only receive guests. At that very moment, the maid handed her mistress a sealed letter with the royal family's coat of arms. She assumed that it could have been written by the crown prince and that it was nothing more than a love letter. At that very moment, the young lady opened the letter and saw an encrypted message. Since the prince wanted to meet her late at night in the castle in order to present her with the necklace. Some time later, the prince stood quietly on the terrace waiting for the young lady. Moment later, he looked away with a smile, as he noticed that she had arrived, and with a smile, he called her Madame Sorceries. He looked at her closely, and asked if he should call her that, or if he should call her by her first name. Abby sighed heavily, and said that it looked like he hadn't written the letter, as the invitation this time was much more laconic. However, she was a little puzzled by this meeting place. He looked into the distance with a smile, and said that she should also look down, because there were pursuers there. Wayne said the young men were watching him, reporting the situation to their masters. He sighed heavily and said that some of the lords would start to suspect something if he suddenly disappeared somewhere. Had he assured his companion that they would not be seen thanks to the invisibility spell cast on them, he was glad that she was capable of such a thing. Abby looked at the young man closely and said that she assumed they could keep it a secret for a while longer. He asked her in surprise surprise what she meant. Did she really want to keep her real identity? He assured her that it would not serve the good of their cooperation. The lady looked at him in surprise, as she did not understand what kind of cooperation he was talking about. He looked at her with a smile and said that everything was correct, and he had a lot of questions for her. Abby sighed heavily as she noticed that the prince really knew how to turn everything inside out. She said that earlier at the ball the king had also wanted to embarrass him, and in the end he had lost face. And now that she came and told everything, he has dirt on her. But again, the young lady could not help but come, because she needed to return the necklace to her mother. He looked at her closely and said with a smile that meeting her was not safe, since he still did not know what she was capable of. But if suddenly she really was powerful enough to break through the protection and erase his memories, then everything he did would be in vain. Abby sighed heavily, but didn't respond to his words. At that very moment, he handed her her own necklace and asked if she would like to try it on. He wanted her to show him how strong she really was. Just like that time, she was taken aback, not knowing what to do. As far as she remembered, magic had no effect on the prince at all. In that case, she could easily use her power, and a moment later she summoned the wind. The young lady was taken aback for a moment, as she saw that when the magic reached him, it seemed to dissipate. At that very moment, she summoned the ghost of the wind bird and directed all her power at the prince. But Abby was taken aback when she saw that all her magic had easily dissipated. She was very surprised, as she had never encountered anything like this before. The Book of Magic also stated that, as a rule, there were only a few circumstances in which magic could be nullified. In the first case, two equal types of magic would collide and mutually destroy each other. The second is an organism that is immune to magic, but in this case, it is usually very vulnerable. But it seemed to her that the prince did not fit into either of these cases. She knew that time, only when their hands touched, she felt the magic work on him. Abby extended her hand to him and asked if he minded. He asked in surprise if she really wanted to touch him. A moment later the prince extended his hand to her. Wayne looked closely at his young companion and said that he too was very curious about what would happen. He wanted to know if he would feel the same as he did then, but after shaking hands they felt nothing. The young lady was puzzled and wondered if she had done something wrong. She took her hand back and sighed heavily. She looked at him with a smile and said that he didn't seem to be particularly strong physically. She thought for a moment, not knowing what and how they were doing wrong, because she remembered what happened last time. But at that very moment she was taken aback, because she remembered that when she accepted the invitation to the ball, she did not feel anything strange. Abby was puzzled and wondered if she had just imagined it. The prince looked closely at his hand, as he had done something strange then, and a discharge of powerful energy. He sighed heavily and said that when their fingertips touched, it was as if a stream of energy had pierced him. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he had felt the same. He said that it was so and at that very moment took off his glove. She was taken aback because she knew that usually clothes did not interfere with magic, but his body was special, so she did not pay attention to it. At that moment the prince sighed heavily and said that they could try again. Abby looked closely at the prince, as he seemed to always wear them, so she assumed he was touchworse. The moment after their hands touched, she felt a new, unknown feeling. She was shocked because she felt a flow of magic. This feeling grew. First she felt an abundance of power, which initially made her feel incredible power, as if in a fog she was being pulled to the very edge, and then the warm spell became sharp thorns. At that very moment, she pulled away from him, and fell to the ground with a crash, as she felt a burning pain. Abby was a little puzzled, as she realized that the magic contained within, it was like steel needles, and at the moment of contact they violently pierced her body. The prince was taken aback and looked at his companion in horror. He did not know how she felt, and wanted to help her with something. Wayne reached out to his companion, but immediately pulled back and asked for forgiveness, because he knew that if he touched her, she would feel pain again. Abby looked at the prince intently, and said that she was fine, and that she was the one who was too careless in this situation. The prince sighed heavily, and looking at the young lady, said that such magic is unbearable for the human body. He looked at her and said that, however it was, she was the first sorceress who had access to it, and now her power was perfectly clear to him. He sighed heavily, and said that he now thought she understood his circumstances. Abby looked at her companion intently, and said that it was late and she had to go back, and as she left, she thanked him for returning the necklace to her, and said that they would see each other again. A moment later, she used her magic and climbed down with ease. She was shocked, and wondered if he had really lived all this time, enduring such excruciating pain. The prince looked after the young lady with a gentle smile, as he wanted to meet her again. The prince looked intently into the distance, as he could no longer make out the young lady, but a moment later he suddenly felt ill. He fell to the ground with a crash, and at that very moment, he felt his strength fading away. But moments later he felt someone's presence. Some time ago, the maid fell to the ground with a crash and looked at her hand in horror. The prince was puzzled. He did not understand what was happening at all, and at the same time he was breathing heavily, as he was in great pain. He reached out to the maid because he wanted to say something, but he couldn't. At the same time, the maid screamed that she had simply touched the prince. She did not know what he had done. Everyone looked at the young master with horror, as they still hoped that he was not cursed. From that moment on, he realized that his existence itself was harmful not only to others, but to himself as well. Sometime later, the magic tree wizards directed holy and powerful energy at him. The young prince was taken aback as a bright light flooded him, but at the same time it caused him pain. He fell to the ground with a crash, as he was tormented by excruciating pain. The emperor was puzzled and angry, because even the great wizards of the magic tree hour were powerless. He understood that magic had no effect on His Highness, the prince now, and at that very moment the emperor was informed that they could cool him with ice and herbal infusions and nothing else. The emperor sighed heavily and looked closely at his son, as he understood that everything was very serious. Then the young prince was paralyzed by pain, but he still felt his father's gaze, indifferent, and as if the person he looked at had no relation to him. He supposed that he should have simply died then and there. But when he opened his eyes again, for the first time in a long time, he saw her. The prince was taken aback, as he did not understand whether this was a dream or reality. He froze for a moment as his mother's hand touched him. The madam hugged her son tightly with a smile and said that in her entire short life, he was the most precious treasure. So she wanted to see him flourish like a sprout and grow healthy and strong like a young tree. She looked at her son with a gentle smile and asked him to take good care of himself. Thanks to those words of that vision, he was able to survive the high temperature. But he had only survived, and now the excessively chaotic magical energy was still accumulating inside him, and it was constantly biting into his body. Although he managed to control her with difficulty, but control is nothing more than a desire not to harm others under any circumstances. At that very moment, he sighed heavily and asked the unexpected guest who he was. He looked at his little brother in surprise when he appeared. Carol sighed heavily and asked his brother if he really still had the strength to talk. He pulled his brother closer to him and said that they needed to get back quickly. Looking at his brother, he said that he would not tell anyone about his current condition. Carl was seething with rage, as he was simply going to watch from afar. At that very moment, he swore nervously. Wayne looked at his brother with a smile and asked when he had managed to grow so much. Carl looked intently at his brother and asked how he could not grow at his age. He told his brother that he would have to look down on him for a few more years. Wayne smiled and said he really hoped to see that day. At that very moment, the young man's face darkened, as he knew that this could happen if someone could save him. Some time later, the young lady quietly returned back. She was very happy, because one way or another she finally got the necklace back. She knew that she needed to replace it with the original as soon as possible. A moment later, she happily returned back to her room, because she knew that everything was finally resolved. But at the same time, the Duke was closely watching his daughter and all her actions outside the door. We, in turn, froze in place as if rooted to the spot, as she felt someone's presence. She turned around and was taken aback, as she saw her father in front of her. He sighed heavily and turning around, said that she should follow him into his office. Some time later they walked silently into the office. The young lady was puzzled, as she realized that this was a very unfortunate mistake on her part. She was so happy about her return that she let her guard down. Some time later, they came to the study, and the Duke offered her tea. She was shocked, since her father actually offered her tea. He sighed heavily and said that although he asked her to come back before 9, she still did nothing wrong, because it was only 12. He said that he asked her not to use magic, but she still used it. He sighed heavily and asked what he should tell her then. Abby was puzzled, because she could see that her father remained calm, but he was beside himself with anger. The Duke sighed heavily and said that, as befits a girl of noble birth, she entered the house through the window, without in the least losing her aristocratic dignity. She looked timidly at her father and asked if he was angry. The Duke was furious. He realized that his daughter was not listening to him, and they continued to drift apart, and besides, she was wandering around somewhere half the night. But he looked at his daughter with a tender smile, and said that he was not angry with her at all. Abby looked closely at her father, as she realized that he was definitely burning with anger and fury, but he was not showing it. He sighed heavily and asked what was the matter. He wanted to know where she really was. She understood that at such moments, the more she said, the worse it would be for her. For a moment the young lady sat quietly, not knowing what to answer. She wondered if she should just remain silent, He sighed heavily, and said that when she left the room, he followed her. And then, he even looked into her room for a second, but then he saw that the window was open, the closet was open, the shoes were scattered, and the remnants of magic were floating in the room. He looked at his daughter with fury, and asked if she really thought he didn't notice that she had stolen the necklace for Togo to practice magic with. The Duke was angry because, on top of everything else, she had run away from home under cover of night. He did not understand what she was actually doing. The young lady hesitated, not knowing what to answer. At that very moment, the Duke could not stand it and shouted, "Did she really go to the Crown Prince?" She froze in shock, as she didn't expect to hear anything like that. The Duke was angry because the prince had given him a firm refusal, but in reality he still took up with his daughter. Abby looked at her father in surprise, and asked why he assumed they were talking about the prince. He was burning with anger and fury, since he was not stupid or blind. After all, she had chosen an appropriate outfit, met with the prince late in the evening, and had a flushed face. Comparing all the facts, he realized that she had gone to meet her lover, but in fact, the young lady had chosen such an outfit by chance. She had not chosen the time at all, and her flushed face was due to physical exertion. But the Duke was burning with rage, for he saw everything in a different light, and this was irrefutable evidence for him. He knew that, although later, meetings between a girl and a boy with good intentions were as old as the world, but he knew it was hard to hold on after just a few meetings. He was furious because he knew his daughter was still a silly little thing, and meetings in the middle of the night never ended well. He simply could not sit and watch calmly as she fell into the trap of a young but treacherous prince. At that very moment, he could not bear it any longer, and shouted that she should not leave the house at night anymore. She smiled and asked if she could leave the house during the day. The Duke was very angry and shouted that she should not leave the house during the day without her brothers either. The next day, the young lady was in drawing class with her brother. Aaron was puzzled. He stared at the small apple he was supposed to draw. Abby looked at her brother in surprise and asked if he really had nothing better to do. She said that he could read a book like his father, go hunting, or go on an inspection trip like his older brother, or he could do paperwork. He looked at his sister with a smile and said that his father said that the best thing he could do was look after her. He smiled and asked if she liked his wonderful work. Abby sighed heavily and said that it was very abstract. At the same moment, she said that her father forbade her to go out unaccompanied during the day, but now she does not go anywhere, and he could leave her. Aaron smiled and said that soon they would go somewhere. She looked at him in surprise and asked where he wanted to take her. He looked at her with a smile and said that after classes they would go somewhere together. Abby looked at him and said that she hadn't agreed to go anywhere with him today. She had just agreed to sit with him for now. He smiled and said that they would talk after he looked at his sister's drawing, but after he looked at her drawing, he was taken aback because he did not understand why she acted this way towards him. He was shocked because he couldn't believe that she had drawn something like that. Aaron looked at his sister with a smile and said that they could talk about their trip a little later. She sighed heavily and said that he was still spontaneous. Sometime later they got out into the city, and the young lady saw a bird, but not a simple one. She was taken aback, because she knew that in front of her now stood the main instigator of scandalous gossip, fictions and fables, romantic birds. After some time, they did not meet the young man, and Aram, having changed his power, told his comrade to immediately apologize to his sister. The young man quickly began to apologize. She looked at the young man in surprise, as she did not understand why he was here. He looked at her with a smile and said that this was the second time they had seen each other. Wabby looked around after a moment, as she did not understand where her brother had taken her. Aaron said with a smile that he had taken her to a store that specialized in the sale and rental of all sorts of unusual and amazing devices and objects, and besides, he was the owner. He told his sister with a smile that this place sold various interesting things that he brought from his travels. She looked at her brother in surprise and asked if the young man was really his employee. She sighed heavily and asked if romantic birds were their merchandise too. He smiled and said that it was true. At that very moment, he looked at his worker and asked angrily what had happened. The young man sighed heavily and asked the young lady to listen to everything he would explain to her. Sometime later, Aaron looked at Nosov, his worker, with fury. He sighed heavily and asked the young man if someone had asked him to bring romantic birds to the ball and show them off, and that a scandal had resulted in his sister being involved. The young man was taken aback and said that everything was exactly like that, but he did not know who the customer was. Aaron was burning with anger and fury. He shouted that they were talking about his sister now. He shouted to the young man that he had told him exactly who his sister was, and he also warned him not to do anything if it concerned his family. The young man told his master that he had said that his sister was precious, elegant and beautiful, like a jewel in the Royal Theatre in Meru, refined. Aaron was proud of such a description of his sister, but at that very moment, the young man said that when he asked the gentleman what his sister looked like, he only answered that she was his perfect treasure, and he would not allow anyone to admire her. The young man said that the man came with a portrait, and he did not recognize the lady, as he had not met her before. He sighed heavily, and said that already halfway through he had guessed that it was his master's sister, but they had to abide by the agreement, so he took such measures, and besides, he knew that the crown prince was a very good party. After he had said this, Aaron was burning with anger and fury. Abby sighed heavily, and said that everything had already happened, and they should not dwell on such things. She would like to ask her brother another question, which interested her very much. She wanted to know where he brought such ingenious magical mechanisms from. Aaron looked closely at his sister, and said that his partner made them. After all, his companion was a very beautiful person, and a high-class-level poppy. He also often made various magical mechanisms for sale or rent, but he always appeared and disappeared without warning, and he rarely saw him. She sighed heavily and asked her brother if he had heard anything about the Flora Amphora. He smiled and said that of course he had heard, that this was a new product that he had recently created. As far as he remembered, it was completely sold out. Aaron looked at the young lady in surprise, and asked why she suddenly started talking about something like that. She was surprised because she visited a mysterious store on the outskirts and saw strange employees. She had no idea that her brother had such connections. Wizards were creatures whose basis was blood and talent, and according to the rules of the sacrament, they only rarely interacted with ordinary people. The tale of imperial power is also partly based on what the royal wizards allowed. The chances of meeting a mage who specializes in magical mechanisms are even lower. She wondered if this poppy could be someone she knew. Aaron looked at his sister in surprise. As he saw that she had been thinking about something a lot lately, he hoped that she would share her thoughts with him. Abby looked at her brother in surprise, and asked if something had happened, but he was taken aback and said that everything was fine. She smiled and said that this store was really charming, interesting, and not even ordinary. She didn't know that he had such a business. She said with a smile that she thought he didn't invite her today to show her around. He looked at her with a smile and said that, as expected, nothing could be hidden from her. Late that very moment, he showed her the project of the jewel restorers. He told his sister with a smile that he wants to use the stones, or lesser quality scraps, to create new fashionable jewelry, because the profit is small, but the sales are large, from small aristocrats and merchants down to ordinary commoners, and this is the new business philosophy of this jewelry store. He said with a smile that the owners of the dime and star were the count and his sister, and they were also his partners. She looked at her brother in surprise and asked if he was here because of what happened to the mine. He smiled and said that they couldn't let their father, an older brother, take on all the burden. He had already been to those mines and seen how badly they had suffered, so he was worried that it would take several years to restore everything. And at the same time, he knew that red rubies were the main source of income for their family, but for now they had to find another way to make up for the losses, because no one wanted to become bankrupt aristocrats. He sighed heavily and said that if they really found another way out, they wouldn't be so helpless if something like this happened again. Abby sighed heavily and asked her brother what he wanted her to do. He looked at her with a satisfied smile, but at that very moment he timidly looked away from her. He smiled and said he wanted money. She smiled and said she didn't expect anything else from him. She said that it seemed that he did not want to use the family's money, so he wanted her to use her connection with the prince. She sighed heavily and said that they could enter into a private matter with the imperial house, but if their father found out, he would be evicted to the stables. He smiled and timidly said that for this reason she needed to cover for him. Abby sighed heavily and asked if he really wanted to do this. She said that they should use not only whole white stones, but they could use broken rubies as accents. She knew that white gemstones were not held in high esteem in the empire, and even commoners did not consider them expensive. Moreover, she wanted the jewelry to be floral-themed. He looked at her in surprise and asked if this was all because of the festival of the goddess of flowers. Abby smiled and said that was right. She said that if he really wanted her help and she wanted to have a share and a say. She looked at him with a smile and said that he should promise her this, and she would think of something with her money.